Summary of the Book of the Dreams. M1. The 200 demons descend to earth. Their descent from heaven stirs up the other heavenly beings. They descend because of the beauty of the women they saw there, and they reveal forbidden arts and heavenly mysteries in order to seduce these women, and they bring about ruin on the earth. Enoch warns that the coming of the 200 demons will lead only to hurting speech and hard labor. They then subjugate the human race, killing hundreds of thousands of the righteous in battle, forcibly marrying beautiful women, and enslaving the nations. The angels veil Enoch, and the righteous endure the burning, and Enoch the sage is mentioned. Samhaza begets two giant sons, Sachim, Oyach, and Patsam, Naraman or Achya, Chaya, and the other demons and Yaksas beget the rest of the giants. So we see that there is one split lineage that came directly from Samyaza, and that one is notable and mentioned, and that all the others the other Yaksas beget the rest of the giants. The giants grow up and wreak ruin upon the earth and the human race. The lamentation of humanity reaches up to heaven. Yima, a transmogrification of the Jewish god according to Mani's Cosmology, accepts the homage of humankind as they plead for help. And someone boasts that Sam and his brother will live and rule forever in their unequaled power and strength. The giant Hobabas, or Humbaba, robs someone of his wife, and the giants fall out among themselves and begin killing one another and other creatures. Sam and his brother are mentioned. It appears that Sam has a dream in which a tablet was thrown in the water. It seems to have borne three signs, one portending woe, one portending their flight, and one portending their destruction. Naraman then has a dream about a garden full of trees and rows, and 200 of something, perhaps trees, are mentioned. Someone recites a list of proverbs involving contrasts, usually between the lesser and the greater or the derivative from the source. Naraman tells how he saw in the dream some who were weeping and lamenting, and many others who were sinful rulers. The giant Mahoe, son of Virogdad, Barakel, of 1 Enoch 6:7, hears a cautioning voice as he flies along at sunrise, and he is guided to safety by Enoch the apostle and the heavenly voice, which warn him to descend before the sun sets his wings on fire, shades of Icarus. He lands, and the voice leads him to Enoch. And fragment M15. Enoch interprets this dream, indicating that the trees represented the egregori, the watchers, and also mentioning the giants who were born of women, something the trees are pulled out of. In M16, someone reports that someone ordered him not to run away, but to bring the message written on 2 stone tablets, showing it first to Naraman. He has brought them in order to share the contents of one tablet pertaining to the demons with the giants. Samazad tells him to read the writing by Enoch. Enoch the apostle gives a message of judgment to the demons and their children, telling them that they will have no peace and that they will see the destruction of their children. He refers to the giants ruling for 120 years, and then he predicts either an era of earthly fecundity, presumably after the flood, or else the flood itself, and he's predicting the flood itself. Sam exhorts the other giants to cheer up and eat, but they are too sorrowful to eat and instead fall asleep. Mahoe goes to Atan Bush, otherwise known as Utnapistim, either another giant or another name for Enoch, and tells him all. When Mahoe returns, Sam has a dream in which he ascends to heaven. He sees the water of the earth consumed with heat, and a demon comes out of the water. Some beings, the protecting spirits, are invisible, but he sees the heavenly rulers. Then M19, Sam, Samazad, and Mahoe have a conversation. So remember that Samazad is Samyaza. Mahoe mentions his father, Virogdad. There are obscure references to weapons and a blessing on someone who saw something and escaped death, or would have escaped death. Sam and Mahoe search for something. Someone gives satisfactory assurance to Mahaway that he will be protected from Som, but nevertheless Som and Mahaway fall out and begin to fight. The wicked demons are glad to see the apostle Enoch and assemble timidly before him. Apparently they promise to reform their ways and they ask for mercy. The wicked demons are glad to see the apostle Enoch and assemble timidly before him. Enoch warns the demons that they will be taken from a fire to face eternal damnation, despite their belief that they would never lose their misused power. He also addresses their sinful misbegotten sons, the giants, and describes how the righteous will fly over the fire of damnation and gloat over the souls inside it. And guard that they stay in there, I would add. M23, they, presumably the demons, take some heavenly helpers hostage. As a result, the angels descend from heaven, terrifying the 200 demons, who take human form and hide among human beings. The angels separate out the human beings and set a watch over them. They seize the giants from the demons and lead them, the children of the giants, to safety in 32 distant towns prepared for them by the living spirit at Aryan Wiesen, the traditional homeland of the Indo-Iranians, in the vicinity of the sacred Mount Sumeru and other mountains. These people originated the arts and crafts. The 200 demons fight a massive and fiery battle with the 4 angels. 24. A Tanbush does battle, accompanied by watchers and giants, and 3 of the giants are killed. An angel and others are also killed. Oyach and Ayach resolve to keep their promise to do battle, and they boast of their prowess. 4 angels, by divine command, bind the Igregori with everlasting chains in a dark prison, and annihilate their children. Even before the rebellion of the Igregori, this prison had been built for them under the mountains. In addition, 36 towns had been prepared for the habitation of the wicked and long-lived sons of the giants before they were even born. Oyah, or Aya, the primordial monster Leviathan, and the archangel Raphael engage in a great battle, and they vanished, according to one tradition. Oyah survived the flood and fought this battle after it. 3,280 years passed between the time of Enoch and the time of King Vishtasp, who ruled at the time of the prophet Zoroaster, who, along with Buddha and Christ, was an apostle who came before the final apostle Mani. There's a couple interesting things I wanted to mention there. That when they talked about they're taken from the fire, it just endure the burning, and Enoch the sage is mentioned. Now that ties into what we've been talking about recently, and some things that I saw that Zen Garcia was talking about in his amazing stuff that he's tied up. And what he was talking about there is that the righteous actually, in between this period and Christ coming back to earth, or coming to earth for the first time, the first appearance of the Savior, that the righteous had to endure that time period in hell, because they had no Savior to come down and take them from Sheol, and that is what happens in the Chronicles of Longinus. And so go and check out that work. I've posted it. It's part of this playlist. It's been part of the playlist that this will be part of. So you can see it there, or go to Zen's work at Endeavor Freedom and check out the Chronicles of Longinus, or Longinus, and the Thracian Chronicles, and you'll see what I'm talking about there. And after that, the other thing that I wanted to notice is that for some reason this person believes that the final apostle was Mani, or Mani. An effort to nuance this version is given after the summary. So A1. The angelic watchers beget the Nephilim and the giants, perhaps the same creatures, but perhaps not, through miscegenation with mortal women. These rapacious monsters inflict bloodshed and injustice upon the earth and destruction upon the sea, animals, plants, cattle, and humanity. All this is reported to Enoch, the scribe of interpretation. Enoch addresses God, praising him for his glory, knowledge, strength, and creative acts. A number of giants, including Hobabus and Humbaba, Mahaway, and perhaps the watcher Barak El, have a conversation in which they discuss killing, perhaps of human beings. Following hints from the Manichaean version and the Midrash of Samyaza, Perhaps we should reconstruct here an episode in which the giants have a first pair of dreams predicting the Great Flood. If so, the first dream seems to involve the effacing of a writing tablet by submerging it in water. Stuckenbrook also suggests that a fragment which refers to 3 shoots in a garden belongs to the second parable. The first dream may have told of an angel doing the effacing as a symbol of the destruction wrought by the flood. The second may have told of an angel descending and cutting down all but 3 shoots, representing the sons of Noah in the garden. Mahaway consults Enoch the first time. It is possible that the first tablet was introduced at this point. These episodes are entirely lost, but their existence is deduced by later references in the fragments. The giants Oya and Mahaway have a conversation in which Mahaway tells Oya something he heard while in the presence of his, Mahaway's father, the Watcher Barakel. Oya responds that he too has heard of 4 marvels, and he starts to make a comparison which pertains to a woman giving birth. There is a conversation among the giants in which one of them admits that, despite his own might, he has been unable to prevail in war against some heavenly beings, presumably the archangels. Oya mentions an oppressive dream which has disturbed him, and someone tells the giant Gilgamesh to recount his dream as well. Oya says something to his brother Haya about the Watcher Azazel, the Watchers, and the giants. In another fragment that may continue this speech, one of the giants resigns himself that there is no escape and that he and the others must die for their misdeeds. He refers to a vision that hinders him from sleeping. Someone enters the assembly of the giants. Perhaps a conversation continues in which the giants anticipate with dread their coming destruction in the flood for their sins, in which they will be stripped of their form and reduced to being evil spirits. The Watchers tell the giants that they themselves are imprisoned and perhaps that the giants are being defeated. Mahaway and the 2 tablets are mentioned. The second tablet is now read. It is a letter from Enoch to the Watcher Semyaza and his companions, and they are rebuked for their and their sons, the giants' corrupt acts, which have come to the attention of the Archangel Raphael. They are warned of imminent destruction and ordered to release their hostages and to pray. Nevertheless, Oya informs the giants of a message from Gilgamesh and Hobabus, which involves the cursing of the princes and which cheers the giants up. The 2 giants Oya and Haya have dreams. Haya describes his in the assembly of the giants. He dreamed of gardeners watering a garden which produced great shoots, but a disaster of some sort destroyed the garden in a deluge of water and fire. The other giants are unable to interpret his dream. Haya proposes that they consult Enoch for an interpretation. Then his brother Oya reports that he too had a dream, in which God descended to the earth, thrones were set up, and God sat enthroned amid a multitude of angels and presided over a judgment based on the opening of certain books. The giants, presumably unable to interpret this dream either, summon Mahaway and send him to Enoch, whom he has encountered before, to ask him to interpret the dreams. Mahaway takes wing and flies across the great desert until Enoch sees him and calls to him. Mahaway refers to this as his second visit and makes the request. Bits of Enoch's interpretation may survive in a fragment that mentions the violent deaths of a number of Watchers, Nephilim, and giants, and also in a small fragment that says, "No peace to you." Enoch pronounces an eschatological or post-diluvian blessing of earthly prosperity. Presumably, much of the story came after this point and is now lost. Reconstruction of the Aramaic Book of Giants remains extremely subjective, but a number of objective factors limit the possible arrangements and point us in certain directions. The most important external factor is the assured sequence of fragments in some of the manuscripts based on physical joins. So we see that they're having problems with putting these things together and seeing how clearly they line up. A third factor is the internal evidence of the fragments themselves. Stuckenbrook, building on Garcia Martinez's comments, allows for passages that pertain to the early part of the Watchers Giants narrative when the giants are free agents, after they, or better the Watchers, have been imprisoned. He also points to the reference to 2 tablets in A10, with the second tablet being read later than the first, and to Mahaway's second visit to Enoch in A13. In both cases, earlier lost portions of the narrative are hinted at. The biggest difference between Stuckenbrook's sequencing and those of some other commentators is that he reconstructs two pairs of two dreams. Bayer, Reeves, and Garcia Martinez grouped the fragments pertaining to dreams into one episode. Cook, however, does reconstruct multiple dream episodes, although not in precisely the same order as Stuckenbrook, and Puek accepts the necessity of an earlier pair of dreams, although he does not accept that the material assigned to the second dream by Stuckenbrook in A5 belongs there. He puts it correctly, in my view, in the first dream. So we see that they really are fighting over how these reconstructions go together. And we see that the founder of the Manichaean religion was the Apostle Mani in 216 to 76 CE, who was raised in southern Mesopotamia in a Jewish Christian Baptist sect called the Elkazites. From age 12 on, Mani began to have visions. Eventually, his visionary experiences led to his being expelled from the sect, and he then founded his own religion, sending out missions to Iran, India, Syria, and Egypt. Late in his life, he fell out of royal favor and was sent to prison, where he died. He wrote detailed scriptures so that his doctrines would be preserved forever, even going so far as to invent a new script to write them in, but over time nearly all of these scriptures have been lost. This makes it very difficult to reconstruct his original theology. We know that he drew on otherworld religions to interpret himself as the culminating revelatory intermediary for Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. We also know that the Manichaean religion taught an extremely complicated system, Gnostic dualism, centered around a cosmological myth about the war between the originally pristine realms of light and darkness. The physical universe was created as a trick to liberate the captive sparks of light in living beings from the realm of darkness. There were two classes of practicing Manichaeans: the elect, who lived ascetic monastic lifestyles of celibacy, vegetarianism, etc., and the hearers, who supported the elect financially and otherwise in the hope of being reincarnated themselves as elect in due course. Although most of Mani's scriptures are themselves lost, lists of the titles of these documents survive in works by both friendly and hostile writers who wrote in Coptic, Greek, Arabic, and even Chinese. Allowing for minor corruptions, all the lists mention the same 7 works, usually in more or less the same order. These are the Gospel, the Treasure of Life, the Pragmatia, the Treatise, the Book of Mysteries, the Book of Giants, the Epistles, and the Psalms. For our immediate purposes, the only one of interest is the Book of Giants, a work apparently composed in Syriac, an Eastern dialect of Aramaic, and the book was entirely lost until the 20th century, but scant references to it survived in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, indicating that it involved battles of the ancient giants. Then, about a century ago, many highly fragmentary Manichaean works written in Central Asian languages were recovered archaeologically at Turfan in China, and much of the find remains unpublished even at present. Should we read that again? Then, about 100 years ago, many fragmentary Manichaean works written in Central Asian languages were recovered at Turfan in China, and much of the find remains unpublished. Among the published fragments are many badly eroded manuscripts of the Book of Giants in various languages. So we see again that they have found this very clearly. They probably have a very clear, good book of it, and we are not given that translation. The Manichaean versions adapted the story of the giants to fit Iranian mythology. Schiavo discusses these adaptations at length, and 3 of the most striking adjustments have to do with the names of the major characters. Sam, or Sam, is the name of the immortal dragon slayer in later Iranian epic. His name is given to the giant Ohiah, and Ohiah's brother Hahia is given the name Naraman, who in Iranian epic is a figure closely connected to Sam, either identified with him or presented as one of his close relatives. The name of the father of the giant Mahoe, the demon Varogdad, means given by lightning in Persian, a loose translation of Barak El, which is Hebrew for lightning of God. The watcher Barak El seems to be the father of Mahoe in the Aramaic version of the Book of Giants. Between Mani's Book of Giants and the stories of the giants related in the Enoch literature and in Jubilees, these were already good indicators of Mani's use of earlier Jewish traditions, a use confirmed by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. These consisted of many hundreds of parchment and papyrus manuscripts in Hebrew and Aramaic, with a few also in Greek, most of which had rotted away into tens of thousands of fragments. Fragments survived as some of the Enoch books in Aramaic, and also the Book of Jubilees in Hebrew. J.T. Millick has also discovered roughly 6 to 10 extremely poorly preserved manuscripts of an Aramaic Book of Giants, apparently the document used by many as the basis for his scriptural work. These manuscripts give no indication of being sectarian compositions. Their paleographic dates fall roughly across the 1st century BCE, so presumably the book was composed before this, although how long before remains open to question. The kernel of the same story appears in the Bible in Genesis 6:1-4, but as with the Book of the Watchers, it remains debatable whether the traditions about the Watchers and Giants are creative expansions of the Genesis passage, or independent transmissions of stories that have been summarized and truncated in Genesis. So, and then it talks about the Midrash of Samyaza, which Millick has published and translated in his edition of some of the Aramaic fragments of the Book of the Giants. And this work tells how at the time of the corrupt generation of the flood, the angels Samyaza and Azazel make a bet with God that if they were to descend from heaven to earth, they would be able to resist the lure of the evil inclination. But after descending, they promptly lose the bet. They notice the beauty of mortal women and cannot restrain themselves from becoming sexually involved with them. Soon they find themselves revealing heavenly secrets to their mortal wives. Semyaza begets sons named Heya and Aheya. The angel Metatron, another name for the deified Enoch in the Hekalah traditions, sends them a warning of the coming flood. Heya and Aheya each have a prognostic dream. In the first, an angel descends from heaven and scrapes an enormous stone tablet with writing on it, which was spread across the whole world until only 4 words remain. In the second, there is a garden full of trees and gems, but an angel descends and cuts down everything but one tree with 3 branches. Both dreams predict the coming of the flood and the destructions of all human beings, except Noah and his 3 sons. The giants are then killed in the flood, but are consoled by the fact that mortals will use their names in incantations, and thus their fame will never cease. Samyaza repents and suspends himself upside down between heaven and earth. Azazel refuses to repent and becomes a demon who entices men to corrupt deeds and who bears the sins of Israel on the Day of Atonement. Leviticus 16:7-10. The numerous and striking parallels with the Book of Giants are obvious. Although there is only one pair of dreams in the Midrash of Samyaza, Stuckenbrook argues that the original Book of Giants had 2 sets, and that this may well be true also of the Manichaean version. Moving now from history of transmission to background influences, the Aramaic Book of Giants draws on ancient Near Eastern myth rather as the Manichaean version draws on Iranian. 2 of the evil giants in the Aramaic version are named Gilgamesh and Hobabus. Gilgamesh is an epic figure in Sumerian and Akkadian literature, best known from the Epic of Gilgamesh, a work whose importance in ancient Mesopotamia was comparable to that of the Homeric epics in ancient Greece. According to the epic, Gilgamesh, a huge, semi-divine man, has many adventures with his friend, the wild man Enkidu. One of these is the slaying of the monster Humbaba in the cedar forest. But Enkidu dies tragically, and Gilgamesh sets out to discover the secret of immortality in order to avoid his friend's fate. He meets Utnapishtim, the Babylonian version of Noah, the only man to survive the flood. Unlike Noah, Utnapishtim was made immortal by the gods. Nevertheless, Gilgamesh fails in his quest, eventually dying and leaving only his heroic fame behind him. The giants Gilgamesh and Hobabus are reflexes of the Gilgamesh and Humbaba Hawawa of the Gilgamesh epic. Likewise, a Sogdian text of the Manichaean version refers to Atanbush, who is either another giant or Enoch under another name. Enoch also survived the flood and was made immortal. Atanbush is clearly a reflex of Utnapishtim, and we may assume that he appeared also in some lost passage or passages in the Aramaic Book of Giants. So now, knowing this more clearly, we can see that that's not what happened. It's just that they simply gave their name to that person. That's the name that in their culture that they had given to that person, when really it was 2 cultures on the opposite, or not even necessarily on the opposite, but on just in different places looking at the same person and calling him a different name. But really, and then retelling the story, and you can see how it's kind of a case of the broken telephone, where when he's speaking to one culture that has one language, that entity is given a name in their language, but to another culture he's given another name. And so you see that it's the same story, and then there's just a bit of broken telephone in the way that the story is told. Just the fact that they have different names, we can actually correlate and see that those names really are the same name and they're the same person over and over. Like Samyaza and Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, that these are really, they're the same people, just with a different name to a different culture. All gods and goddesses of the pantheons of the Greek, Roman, are really based on the Etruscan pantheon of gods. We know this from the Etrusca Disciplina texts. In Etruscan mythology, a corpus of texts termed the Etrusca Disciplina have been found. This name appears in Valerius Maximus, and Marcus Tullius Cicero refers to a disciplina in his writings. He implies that he reads the texts of the Etruscans, that is, the Etrusca Disciplina, including the reports of the Haruspex, Tarchon, and others. Tages is the infant oracle who gave the Etruscans the Disciplina Etrusca. All point to the great antiquity and cultural importance of Tages. And Tyrrhenos, which is where the Tyrrhenian Sea gets its name from. And also you can see how that's related to the work, or to the word Tyr, as in Tyras, as in King Tyras, the king of Thrace and Thracia, which we'll also come back to in some other portions in a moment, about who King Tyras and Thrace is in the biblical sense and where he comes from. And we're also going to tie this in further with who the Etruscans are, where this area is in the world, namely Sardinia. And we're going to tie this in a moment with the Septuagint. And there are some parts of the Septuagint that discuss this very explicitly. A haruspex, a haruspex. In the religion of ancient Rome, a haruspex, or haruspices, also called eruspex, was a person trained to practice a form of divination called haruspicy, the inspection of the entrails of sacrificed animals, especially the livers of sacrificed sheep and poultry. The reading of omens, specifically from the liver, is also known by the Greek term hepatoscopy, also hepatomancy. The Roman concept is directly derived from Etruscan religion, as one of the three branches of the Disciplina Etrusca. Such methods continued to be used into the Middle Ages, with Thomas Becket apparently consulting both an Haruspex and a chiromancer prior to a royal expedition against Brittany. The Babylonians were famous for hepatoscopy, or hepatoscopy. This practice is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel 21:21. For the king of Babylon stands at the parting of the way, at the head of the two ways, to use divination. He shakes the arrows. He consults the household idols. He looks at the liver. The Nineveh library texts name more than a dozen liver-related terms. The liver was considered the source of the blood and hence the basis of life itself. From this belief, the Babylonians thought they could discover the will of the god by examining the livers of carefully selected sheep. Ioannis Laurentius Liddus lived in the 6th century AD. Although the last classical period writer to have read the books, he is the most specific about his sources. He implies that he read the texts of the Etruscans, that is, the Etrusca discipline, including the report of the Haruspex. Tarchon, who was instructed by Tyrrhenus, Tarchon's work on Tages, he says, is a dialogue in which Tarchon asks Tages questions in the ordinary language of the Italians. This is presumably vulgar Latin, as Liddus cannot mean any early Italic dialect. Tages' recorded response is in ancient letters, presumably in the Etruscan language. Liddus says it is not very understandable and that he relies on translations. Representations of Tages or Tages. Labeled Etruscan representations of Tages are very rare, and scenes clearly tied to the Tages myth are almost as rare. Figures leaning on the litus, the crooked staff of the augur, or examining entrails wearing the conical cap of the haruspex are common, but are not necessarily Tages. Winged figures representing divinity are also common, especially on funerary urns from Tarquinia, but whether any depict Tages is questionable. Assuming that a certain percentage of these representations are, in fact, Tages, there appears to be no standard way to depict him. Art historians have inserted Tages freely among them, but entirely in a speculative fashion. In addition to the labeled scene on the bronze mirror ascribed above, which must have been repeated many times without labels, a type of scene engraved on 4th century BC gemstones, once set in seal rings, appears to describe the Tages myth. A bearded figure, Tarkon, bends over as though listening at the head and torso of another, beardless figure, embedded in or arising from the ground. According to legend, Tages appeared at plough time and taught Etruscans divination. He was born directly from a freshly ploughed plot, or is the grandson of Jove. Cicero reports the myth in this way. They tell us that one day, as the land was being ploughed in the territory of Tarquinii, and a deeper furrow than usual was made, suddenly Tages sprang out of it and addressed the ploughman. Tages, as it is recorded in the work of the Etrurians, Libri Etrusci, possessed the visage of a child, but the prudence of a sage. When the ploughman was surprised at seeing him, and in his astonishment made a great outcry, a number of people assembled around him, and before long all the Etrurians came together at the spot. Tages then discoursed in the presence of an immense crowd, who noted his speech and committed it to writing. The information they derived from this Tages was the foundation of the science of the soothsayers, the haruspicinii disciplina, and was subsequently improved by the accession of many new facts, all of which confirmed the same principles. We received this record from them. This record is preserved in their sacred books, and from it the augurial discipline is deduced. In Ovid's version, Tyrannus Erator, a Tyrrhenian ploughman, observed a clod turn into a man and began to speak of things destined to happen, and how the Etruscan people could discover the future. Ovid, as a poet primarily interested in telling a good story, would have the less historically credible view. Tages was a founding prophet of Etruscan religion who is known from reports by Latin authors of the late Roman Republic and Roman Empire. He revealed a cosmic view of divinity and correct methods of ascertaining divine will concerning events of public interest. Divination was undertaken in Roman society by priestly officials called haruspices. Political officials, also such as the augurs, were constituted with some responsibilities for divination. While the religion flourished, these priests accompanied public officials, including generals in the field, and were consulted on everything of interest to the Senate and people of Rome. The religious texts recording to the revelations of Tages and a few other prophets, mainly a female figure known as Vigoia, were called by the Romans the Etrusca Disciplina, at least as early as the late Republic. They were written in the Etruscan language, despite their Latin titles. None presently survive. The last author claiming to have read elements of the Disciplina is the 6th century John the Lydian, writing at Constantinople. Thus, knowing of Tages comes mainly from what is said about him by the classical authors, which is a legendary and quasi-mythical view. As the Etruscan alphabet had no G, Tages is most likely to be a Latinization of an Etruscan word. The reverse of a 3rd BC bronze mirror from Tuscania depicts a youthful haruspex in a conical hat examining a liver. He is labeled Pavatarches. A second, older haruspex with a beard listens and is labeled Avi Tarquinus. Massimo Pallottino made the generally accepted suggestion that the first name is to be segmented Pavatarches and means the child Tarches. The second name is the son of Tarchon, where Tarchon is the legendary king of Tarquinia, location of Tages' revelation, and also one of the founders of the Etruscan League. So interesting about this is that these religious sites in Etruria, near Rome, this is the original version of what we would think of as the Bohemian Grove and the Midsummer Night's rituals in the Grove. Etruscan mythology. Etruscan religion and mythology were partly incorporated into classical Roman culture, including the Roman pantheon. The Senate adopted key elements of their religion, which were perpetuated by haruspices and noble Roman families who claimed Etruscan descent long after the general population had forgotten the language.
However, in the last years of the Roman Republic, the religion began to fall out of favor and was satirized by such notable public figures as Marcus Tullius Cicero. The Julio Claudians, especially Claudius, who claimed a remote Etruscan descent, maintained a knowledge of the language and religion for a short time longer, but this practice soon ceased. A number of canonical works in the Etruscan language survived until the middle of the first millennium AD, but were destroyed by the ravages of time, decree of the Roman Senate, and by fire. An Etruscan mural of Typhon from Tarquinia. The Etruscan system of belief was an immanent polytheism. All visible phenomena were considered to be manifestations of divine power, and that power was embodied in deities who acted continually on the world, but could be dissuaded or persuaded by mortal men. Long after the assimilation of the Etruscans, Seneca the Younger said that the difference between the Romans and the Etruscans was that, whereas we believe lightning to be released as a result of the collision of clouds, they believe that the clouds collide so as to release lightning. For as they attribute all to deity, they are led to believe that not things have a meaning insofar as they occur, but rather that they occur because they must have a meaning. Spirits and deities. Around the mun or muni or tombs, where the man or mani, Latin manes, the souls of the ancestors. In iconography after the 5th century BC, the deceased are shown traveling to the underworld. In several instances of Etruscan art, such as in the Francois tomb in Volci, a spirit of the dead is identified by the term Hinthiel, literally one who is underneath. A god was called an Ai, later A, which in the plural is Alsar. The abode of a god was a Fanu or Luth, a sacred place, such as a Favi or a grave or a temple. There, one would need to make a fier, a plural fierka or fierkua, or offering. Three layers of deities are portrayed in Etruscan art. One appears to be lesser divinities of an indigenous origin, Catha and Usil, the sun, Tivir, the moon, Selvans, a civil god, Turan, the goddess of love, Laren, the god of war, Length, the goddess of death, Maris, Thalna, terms, and the god Fuflans, whose name is related in some unknown way to the city of Populonia and the Populus Romanus. Ruling over them were higher deities that seem to reflect the Indo-European system. Tin, or Tinia, the sky, Uni, his wife, Juno, and Sel, the earth goddess. As a third layer, the Greek gods were adapted by the Etruscan system during the Etruscan Orientalizing period of 750 through 600 BC. Examples are Ariadne, Artemis, Minerva, Minerva, Latin equivalent of Athena, and Pasha, which is Bacchus, the Latin equivalent of Dionysus. And over time, the primary trinity became Tinia, Uni, and Minerva. Mythological figures. A list of Etruscan mythological figures and a list of Etruscan names for Greek heroes. Seers and divinations. The Etruscans believed their religion had been revealed to them by seers, the two main ones being Tages, a childlike figure born from tilled land who was immediately gifted with prescience, and Vagoia, a female figure. The Etruscans believed in intimate contact with divinity, They did nothing without proper consultation with the gods and signs from them. These practices were taken over in total by the Romans. Etrusca Disciplina. The Etruscan scriptures were a corpus of texts termed the Etrusca Disciplina. This name appears in Valerius Maximus, and Marcus Tullius Cicero refers to a disciplina in his writings on the subject. Massimo Palatino summarizes the known scriptures. The Libri Haruspicini, containing the theory and rules of divination from animal entrails. The Libri Fulgurales, describing divination from lightning strikes. And the Libri Rituales. The last is composed of the Libri Fatales, detailing the religiously correct methods of founding cities and shrines, draining fields, formulating laws and ordinances, measuring space, and dividing time. The Libri Acherontici, dealing with the hereafter, and the Libri Ostentaria, containing rules for interpreting prodigies. The revelations of the prophet Tages were given in the Libri Tagetici, which included the Libri Haruspicini and the Acherontici, and those of the prophetess Vigoia in the Libri Vigoici, which included the Libri Fulgurales and part of the Libri Rituales. These works did not present prophecies or scriptures in the ordinary sense. The Etrusca Disciplina foretold nothing itself, to have had no systematic ethics or religion and no great visions. Instead, they concentrated on the problem of the will of the gods, questioning why, if the gods created the universe and humanity, and have a will and a plan for everyone and everything in it, they did not devise a system for communicating that will in a clear manner. The Etruscans accepted the inscrutability of their gods' wills. They did not attempt to rationalize or explain divine actions or formulate any doctrines of the gods' intentions. As answer to the problem of ascertaining the divine will, they developed an elaborate system of divination. That is, they believed the gods offer a perpetual stream of signs in the phenomena of daily life, which, if read rightly, can direct humanity's affairs. These revelations may not be otherwise understandable and may not be pleasant or easy, but are perilous to doubt. The Etrusca Disciplina, therefore, was mainly a set of rules for the conduct of all sorts of divination. Palatino calls it a religious and political constitution. It does not dictate what laws shall be made or how humans are to behave, but rather elaborate rules for asking the gods these questions and receiving answers. Cicero said, "For a hasty acceptance of an erroneous opinion is discreditable in any case, and especially so in an inquiry as to how much weight should be given to auspices, to sacred rites, and to religious observances. For we run the risk of committing a crime against the gods if we disregard them, or of becoming involved in old women's superstitions if we approve them." He then quipped regarding divination from a singing of frogs. Who could suppose that frogs had this foresight? And yet they do have by nature some faculty of premonition, clear enough of itself, but too dark for human comprehension. Divinatory inquiries, according to discipline, were conducted by priests, whom the Romans called haruspices or sacerdotes. Tarquinii had a college of 60 of them. The Etruscans, as evidenced by the inscriptions, used several words. Capon, Sabine Cupencus, Maru, Umbrian Maron, Eisnev, Hatrenchu, priestess. They called the art of haruspicy Zik Nethshrak. A special magistrate, the Keches, looked after the Kecha or wrath, the sacred things. Every man, however, had his religious responsibilities, which were expressed in an alumnath or slicacious, a sacred society. No public event was conducted without the Netzvis, the haruspex, or his female equivalent, the Nethstra, who would read the bumps on the liver of a properly sacrificed sheep. We have a model of a liver made of bronze, whose religious significance is still a matter of heated debate, marked into sections which perhaps are meant to explain what a bump in that region would mean. This is obviously exactly what it is, and I think that these things still go on, and that this is really how it's one of the ways that they divine and divinate and speak with entities from the pit. And that this rite has been passed down. They seem to have a lot of information about it, considering that there's no information about it, and that it was all burned and destroyed. And yet they have all the names of all of it all pieced together here. And I would speculate that they still are doing this. In this place where you can see this photograph here, rare Etruscan Fanu located at Orvieto. Etruscan beliefs concerning the hereafter appear to be an amalgam of influences. The Etruscans shared general early Mediterranean beliefs, such as the Egyptian belief that survival and prosperity in the hereafter depend on the treatment of the deceased's remains. Etruscan tombs imitated domestic structures and were characterized by spacious chambers, wall paintings, and grave furniture. In the tomb, especially on the sarcophagus, examples shown below, was a representation of the deceased in his or her prime, often with a spouse. Not everyone had a sarcophagus. Sometimes the deceased was laid out on a stone bench. As the Etruscans practiced mixed inhumation and cremation rites, the proportion depending on the period, cremated ashes and bones might be put into an urn in the shapes of a house or a representation of the deceased. In addition to the world still influenced by terrestrial affairs, was a transmigrational world beyond the grave, patterned after the Greek Hades. It was ruled by Aita, or Aita, and the deceased was guided there by Sharun, the equivalent of death, who was blue and wielded a hammer. The Etruscan Hades was populated by Greek mythological figures, and a few, such as Tukulcha, of composite appearance. The mythology is evidenced by a number of sources in different media. For example, representations on large numbers of pottery, inscriptions and engraved scenes on the Praenestine Cistiae, ornate boxes, see under Etruscan language, and on specula, ornate hand mirrors. Currently, some 24 fascicles of the Corpus Speculorum Etruscorum have been published. Specifically, Etruscan mythological and cult figures appear in the Lexicon Iconographum Mythologiae Classicae. Etruscan inscriptions have recently been given a more authoritative presentation by Helmut Rix. Etruskisch text. Interpretatio Graeca, the Greek translation or interpretation by means of Greek models, is a discourse in which ancient Greek religious concepts and practices, deities, and myths are used to interpret or attempt to understand the mythology and religion of other cultures. It is thus a comparative methodology that looks for equivalencies and shared characteristics. The phrase may describe Greek efforts to explain others' beliefs and myths, as when Herodotus describes Egyptian religion in terms of perceived Greek analogues, or when Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Plutarch document Roman cults, temples, and practices under the names of equivalent Greek deities. Interpretatio Graeca may also describe non-Greeks' interpretation of their own belief systems by comparison or assimilation with Greek models, as when Romans adapt Greek myths and iconography under the names of their own gods. And what we really see happening here is the fact that these potentates that were called gods by the Etruscans were passed down to the Greeks and the Romans, but what they really were the fallen angels, the Watchers' sons, the men of old, the men of great renown who carried the knowledge of their forefathers, of their fathers, the fallen angels, who taught man all arts, all of the 7 classical arts, and passed on all of that knowledge, and therefore they were considered gods and considered great men, and that's where all these stories around them were created, when really what they are is the stories of the fallen and the fallen angels. We know that these families that are still part of the papacy and were directly involved in the current Pope's ascension to his position, that they trace their roots back to these Etruscans and to these great families. These 13 bloodlines of the Illuminati all trace their bloodlines back to these snake bloodlines that are related to the Etruscans and are still housed and still concentrate their family's value and their family's wealth around Rome and around this area, around Sardinia in Italy. And now we're going to look at the quotes from the Septuagint regarding the men of the pit of Sheol, of the giants being put in the pit, and Sardinia, and them coming back from Sardinia, from the pit. And we're also going to tie this in with, obviously, with CERN, which is located at the Swiss border, not too far from this area, on top of an ancient temple to Apollo, which, as we see, is really an Etruscan god, and is really not a god at all. It was the son of Samyaza, who is known as Apollo to us, to the Greek, and known as Shamash to the Babylonians. Isaiah 13. The judgment against Babylon. The vision which Isaiah, son of Amos, saw against Babylon. Lift up a standard on the mountain of the plain. Exalt the voice to them. Beckon with the hand. Open the gates, ye rulers. I give command, and I bring them. Giants are coming to fulfill my wrath. Rejoicing at the same time and insulting, a voice of many nations on the mountains, even like to that of many nations, a voice of kings and nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts has given command to a warlike nation, to come from a land afar off, from the utmost foundation of heaven. The Lord and his warriors are coming to destroy all the world. Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is near, and destruction from God shall arrive. Therefore every hand shall become powerless, and every soul of man shall be dismayed. The elders shall be troubled, and pangs shall seize them, as of a woman in travail. And they shall mourn one to another, and shall be amazed, and shall change their countenance as a flame. For behold, the day of the Lord is coming, which cannot be escaped, a day of wrath and anger, to make the world desolate, and to destroy sinners out of it. For the stars of heaven, and Orion, and all the host of heaven, shall not give their light, and it shall be dark at sunrise, and the moon shall not give her light. And I will command evils for the whole world, and will visit their sins on the ungodly. And I will destroy the pride of transgressors, and will bring low the pride of the haughty. And they that are left shall be more precious than gold tried in the fire, and a man shall be more precious than the stone that is in Suphir. For the heavens shall be enraged, and the earth shall be shaken from her foundation, because of the fierce anger of the Lord of hosts, in the day in which his wrath shall come on. And they that are left shall be as a fleeing fawn, and as a stray sheep, and there shall be none to gather them, so that a man shall turn back to his people, and a man shall flee to his own land. For whosoever shall be taken shall be overcome, and they that are gathered together shall fall by the sword, and they shall dash their children before their eyes, and they shall spoil their houses, and shall take their wives. Behold, I will stir up against you the Medes, who do not regard silver, neither have they need of gold. They shall break the bows of the young men, and they shall have no mercy on your children, nor shall your eyes spare thy children. And Babylon, which is called glorious by the king of the Chaldeans, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall any enter into it for many generations. Neither shall the Arabians pass through it, nor shall shepherds at all rest in it. But wild beasts shall rest there, and the houses shall be filled with howling, and monsters shall rest there, and devils shall dance there, and satyrs shall dwell there, and hedgehogs shall make their nests in their houses. It will come soon, and will not tarry. Bel and the dragon. What we're going to see in this is that there is another backing up of the scripture that dinosaurs were real and existed while humans existed. So Bel and the dragon, Apocrypha. This is from the edition of the Greek text, which is the New English translation of the Septuagint. Bel and the dragon. From a prophecy of Habakkuk, the son of Jesus of the tribe of Levi, there was a certain person, a priest, whose name was Daniel, son of Habal, a companion of the king of Babylon. And there was an idol, Bel, which the Babylonians would revere. Now every day they were squandering on it 12 bushels of choice flour, and 4 sheep, and 6 measures of oil. And the king would revere him, and the king would go every day, and would do obeisance to him. But Daniel would pray to the Lord. And the king said to Daniel, Why do you not do obeisance to Bel? And Daniel said to the king, I revere no one except the Lord God, who created heaven and earth. So the king said to him, Is this one, then, not a god? Do you not see how much is spent for him every day? And Daniel said to him, Not at all. Do not let anyone mislead you, for this one is only of clay inside and bronze outside. Moreover, I swear to you by the Lord God of the gods that this one has never eaten anything. And angered, the king called the leaders of the temple and said to them, Produce the one who eats the things prepared for Bel, but if not, you shall die. Or Daniel, who says they are not being eaten by him. But they said, It is Bel himself who eats them. Then Daniel said to the king, Let it be so. Unless I prove that Bel is not eating them, I shall die, and all those with me. Now there were 70 priests of Bel, not counting wives and children. So he brought the king into the idol's temple. And the food was set out in the presence of the king and Daniel, and the mixed wine was brought in and set out before Bel. And Daniel said, You yourself see, O king, that these things are set down. You then seal the bolts of the shrine when it is closed. Now the word pleased the king. Now Daniel commanded those with him, after everyone departed from the temple, to strew the whole shrine with ashes, though no one else except him knew. And then, as he sealed the shrine, he commanded that it be sealed with the king's signet, and with the signets of certain illustrious priests. And so it happened. And it happened on the next day that they went to the place. But the priests of Bel, after entering through false doors, had eaten everything laid out for Bel, and had drunk the wine. And Daniel said, Men, priests, examine your seals whether they remain. And you also, O king, observe carefully lest anything be out of order to you. And they found the seal as it was, and they broke the seal. And when they opened the doors, they saw everything that had been set out consumed, and the tables empty. And the king was thrilled, and said to Daniel, Bel is great, and there is no deceit in him. And Daniel laughed exceedingly, and said to the king, Come, see the deceit of the priests. And Daniel said, O king, these footprints, whose are they? And the king said, Of men and women and children. And he went to the house where the priests were staying, and they found Bel's food and the wine. And Daniel showed the king the false doors through which the priests would enter, and consume what was set out for Bel. And the king brought them out of Bel's temple, and handed them over to Daniel. And he gave the provision that was for him to Daniel, but he destroyed Bel. And there was a dragon in that same place, and the Babylonians would revere it. And the king said to Daniel, Surely you shall not also say about this one that he is bronze. Look, he lives and eats and drinks. Do obeisance to him. And Daniel said, O king, give me permission, and I will slay the dragon without iron or club. And the king agreed with him and said, I have given it to you. And taking 30 minas of pitch and fat and hair, Daniel boiled them together, and having made a cake, he threw it into the mouth of the dragon. And after eating, it burst open, and he showed it to the king, saying, Aren't these the things you revere, O king? And all those from the country assembled against Daniel and said, The king has just now become a Judean. He has destroyed Bel and killed the dragon. And when the king saw that the crowd from the country had united against him, he called his companions and said, I am giving Daniel over for destruction. Now there was a pit in which 7 lions would be fed, to which the conspirators of the king would be delivered, and every day 2 bodies condemned to death would be provided for them. And the crowd threw Daniel into that pit so that he might be devoured, and not even have the good fortune of a burial. And Daniel was in the pit 6 days. And it happened on the 6th day, and Habakkuk was having bread broken in a bowl of boiled soup, and a jar of mixed wine, and was on his way to the plain to the reapers. And an angel of the Lord spoke to Habakkuk, saying, This is what God says to you. The food that you have, take it to Daniel, the one of Balthazar, in the lion's pit in Babylon. And Habakkuk said, Lord God, I have not seen Babylon, and I do not know where the pit is. And when the angel of the Lord had taken Habakkuk by the hair of his head, he set him down above the pit that was in Babylon. And Habakkuk said to Daniel, Rise, eat the food that God has sent you. And Daniel said, For the Lord God, who does not forsake those who love him, has remembered me. And Daniel ate. Then the angel of the Lord put Habakkuk whence he took him on that same day. Now the Lord God remembered Daniel. Now after these things the king came out mourning Daniel. And when he stooped down into the pit, he saw him seated. And when he had shouted out, the king said, The Lord God is great, and there is no other besides him. And the king brought Daniel out from the pit, and threw into the pit those responsible for his ruin before Daniel, and they were devoured. Some parts that seem a little strange in that part are answered in the Theodotion version. And King Astyages was added to his ancestors, and Cyrus the Persian received his kingdom. And Daniel was a companion of the king, and was honored beyond all his friends. And the Babylonians had an idol, whose name was Bel, and each day they would spend on him 12 bushels of choice flour, and 40 sheep, and 6 measures of wine. And the king would revere him, and would go every day to do obeisance to him. But Daniel kept doing obeisance to his God. And the king said to him, Why do you not do obeisance to Bel? So he answered, Because I do not revere idols made with hands, but the living God, who created heaven and earth, and has dominion over all flesh. And the king said to him, Do you not think that Bel is a living God? Or do you not see how much he eats and drinks every day? And laughing, Daniel said, Do not be deceived, O king, for this one is only clay inside, and bronze outside, and he has never eaten nor drunk anything. And angered, the king called his priests and said to them, If you do not tell me who is eating this provision, you shall die. But if you show that Bel is eating them, Daniel shall die, because he has spoken blasphemy against Bel. And Daniel said to the king, Let it be done according to your word. And there were 70 priests of Bel, apart from wives and children. And the king went with Daniel into the house of Bel. And the priests of Bel said, Lo, we are now going outside. So you, O king, set out the food and place the wine when you have mixed it, and shut the door and seal it with your signet. And when you return in the morning, if you do not find everything eaten by Bel, we will die, or Daniel, who is telling lies against us. Now they were contemptuous, for beneath the table they had made a hidden entrance, and they used to go through it regularly and consume them. And it happened as they had gone out, the king also set out the food for Bel. And Daniel ordered his servants, and they brought ashes, and they strewed the whole shrine, in the presence of the king alone. And as they went out, they shut the door and sealed it with the king's signet and departed. Then the priests came during the night, according to their custom, and their wives and children, and they ate and drank everything. And the king readied early in the morning, and Daniel with him. And he said, Are the seals unbroken, Daniel? Then he said, They are unbroken, O king. And it happened as soon as the doors opened, when the king looked at the table, he shouted in a loud voice, You are great, O Bel, and there is no deceit in you, not one. And Daniel laughed and restrained the king, so that he could not enter inside, and said, Look now at the floor, and notice whose footprints these are. And the king said, I see the footprints of men and women and children. And enraged, the king then arrested the priests and their wives and children. And they showed him the hidden doors through which they used to enter and consume what was on the table. And the king killed them and gave Bel entirely over to Daniel. And he destroyed him in his temple. And there was a great dragon, and the Babylonians used to revere it. And the king said to Daniel, You cannot say that this is not a living God, so do obeisance to it. And Daniel said, I will do obeisance to the Lord my God, because he is a living God. But you, O king, give me permission, and I shall kill the dragon without iron or rod. And the king said, I give it to you. And Daniel took pitch and fat and hair and boiled them together, and made cakes and gave them into the mouth of the dragon. And after eating, the dragon burst open. And he said, "See your objects of reverence." And it happened when the Babylonians heard, they were very indignant and conspired against the king and said, "The king has become a Judean. He has destroyed Bel and killed the dragon and slaughtered the priests." And when they came to the king, they said, "Hand Daniel over to us, and if not, we will kill you and your household." And the king saw that they were pressing him hard, and having been compelled, he handed Daniel over to them. So they threw him into the lion's pit, and he was there 6 days. Now there were 7 lions in the pit, and daily 2 bodies and 2 sheep were given to them. But then nothing was given to them, so that they would devour Daniel. And the prophet Habakkuk was in Judea, and he had boiled a stew and broken bread into a bowl, and was on his way to the plain to take it to the reapers. And an angel of the Lord said to Habakkuk, "Take the food that you have to Babylon to Daniel in the lion's den." And Habakkuk said, "Lord, I have not seen Babylon, and I do not know about the pit." And the angel of the Lord took hold of the crown of his head, and carrying him by the hair of his head, set him down in Babylon above the pit in a rush of his spirit. And Habakkuk shouted, saying, "Daniel, Daniel, take the food that God has sent you." And Daniel said, "For you have remembered me, O God, and have not forsaken those who love you." And having risen, Daniel ate. Then the angel of God immediately returned Habakkuk to his place. Now on the 7th day the king came to mourn Daniel. And he came to the pit and looked in, and lo, Daniel was seated. And when he had shouted out with a loud voice, he said, "You are great, O Lord, the God of Daniel, and there is no other besides you." And he pulled him out, but threw into the pit those responsible for attempting his ruin. And they were immediately devoured before him. Bel and the dragon. What we'll notice there is that the dragon was a live, breathing being. Now we can also look at what that king, we can look at his gates on the Ishtar gates, and we can see what the dragon might have looked like.
The abundant evidence shows that there was only one period in ancient Egyptian history when 4, 6, and 8-spoked chariot wheels were used. In his article, Observations on the Evolving Chariot Wheel in the 18th Dynasty, James K. Hoffmeyer in 1976 explains that it was only at the beginning of the 18th Dynasty that the chariot comes into use in the Egyptian army. He also relates how it was only during the 18th Dynasty that the 4, 6, and 8-spoked wheels were used, and that monuments can actually be dated by the number of spokes in the wheel. Exodus 14:6. And he made ready his chariot, and took his people with him, and he took 600 chosen chariots, and all the chariots of Egypt, and captains over every one of them. The Pharaoh took with him every chariot in Egypt, his own, his captains who headed the divisions, and a group called his chosen chariots, which seemed to be in addition to his regular army. There is an inscription of Ramses Meriamun that tells that he had an army of 20,000 troops, which was divided into 4 divisions. This implies that each division consisted of 5,000 troops, but many times the Pharaoh took more than just soldiers into battle. The priesthood and the military were closely associated. The Egyptian government was a combination church and state, so to speak. There were many, many gods in ancient Egypt, but the ultimate god was the one represented as the sun and known throughout the various times as Amun, Aten, and Ra or Re. After the flood, God called a man named Abram to leave his country, friends, and family and go to a land called Canaan. Because of his faithfulness to the true God while the world around him fast fell to idolatry, the Lord made Abram a promise. "I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." Abram lived in Ur of the Chaldees. There were several ancient cities by the name of Ur, but the phrase Ur of the Chaldees makes it clear which city was Abram's home. The Urartuans worshipped a group of gods whom they called the Chaldees. Near Lake Van, several inscriptions have been found, one of which mentions 63 gods followed by 16 goddesses. One inscription states, "This is the spoil of the cities which I obtained for the people of Chaldees in 1 year." Ur today is called Urfa, and was in the plain of Shinar, where the great apostasy of Noah's family had fully bloomed into profound paganism. Abram's family had remained near Babel when the other groups had left the region. When he received the command to leave for Canaan, Abram gathered his family and left Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there. Ancient Haran, where they stopped and stayed until Abram's father died, still bears its ancient name and is located just 19 miles down the Balak River from ancient Ur. Further evidence of Abram, later called Abraham, in this region is the presence of the names of other members of his family, all still preserved within a radius of about 25 miles. His great-grandfather, Serug's, name is preserved in the town of Suruk, about 22 miles west of Haran. And between Haran and Urfa is Tel Terahi, which means the ruin of Terah, who was Abraham's father. And of course Haran was the name of Abram's brother, who was the father of Lot. Slowly at first, in Canaan Abraham's family grew. His son Isaac bore 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. It was Jacob who would inherit the position of patriarch at Isaac's death, and it was his sons and grandsons who would one day formally become the nation called Israel. Among the 12 sons of Jacob, one was especially favored by him, Joseph. And unwisely Jacob showed his favor by bestowing upon the boy a special coat of many colors, which caused great jealousy among the other sons. Their jealousy was made even greater by the dreams that Joseph had and shared with his family, dreams which indicated that he would one day occupy a position of great authority, and that the others would bow down unto him. One day when his older brothers were tending the flocks in Shechem, Jacob sent Joseph to see if all was well with them. When Joseph approached them from afar, the brothers' jealousy caused them to plot Joseph's death. Only his brother Reuben saved the 17-year-old's life by insisting that they not kill him, but instead cast him into a pit. Stripping him of his special coat, they did so, and when a company of Ishmaelites taking spices and balm to Egypt approached, they decided to sell their brother as a common slave to these men for 20 pieces of silver. But in spite of the horrendous betrayal and ordeal this young man suffered, Joseph remained faithful to the God of his fathers and became a shining light in a land of darkness. He accepted his life in this foreign land among a heathen nation and became a trusted servant to a high-ranking official of the Pharaoh. Then Joseph was falsely accused of a terrible crime and was imprisoned. When all hope must have appeared lost, he was summoned to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. The interpretation of those dreams by Joseph had warned of an impending 7-year famine, which was to follow a 7-year period of plenty. Deeply impressed by the young man, Pharaoh asked Joseph's advice on what to do to avert a great nationwide calamity, and because of the wisdom displayed in his reply, the Pharaoh appointed him to collect the grain and prepare for the famine. So grateful was the Pharaoh to Joseph and his God that he appointed Joseph to a position second only to the Pharaoh. "Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou." And it was through the obedience of Joseph that a special haven for the descendants of Abraham was provided. During the famine, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt to get grain. There Joseph recognized his brothers whom he had long ago forgiven. After he had tested them, he revealed his identity to the shocked and fearful sons of Jacob. When they realized Joseph intended no harm to them in spite of their grievous deed, they obeyed Joseph's command that they bring their father and entire family to Egypt. During the famine, Joseph had bought all the land of Egypt for the Pharaoh except for land grants made to the various priests, and allowed the people to live on the land and return 1/5 of their increase to the king. When Jacob's family arrived, the Pharaoh honored Joseph by bestowing upon them the right to live in the best of the land of Egypt, the land of Goshen, which was the beautiful and fertile Nile Delta. It is also called the land of Ramses, or Ra, the Creator, the sun god. And it was here that God's chosen people would grow and thrive, from the 70 souls who came with Jacob, until they became a great multitude. Though many have claimed there is no evidence of the story of Joseph in ancient Egypt, on an island just below the first cataract of the Nile, an ancient inscription written around the 4th century B.C. was found which claimed to be a copy of a document written by Pharaoh Djoser more than 1,000 years earlier. It is the story of a land grant made by the Pharaoh to the priests of the god Num. It tells of 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty, how Pharaoh had a dream and consulted his chancellor for help. It contains most elements of the 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty story, although they were corrupted in this account, written over 1,000 years after the event took place. But most importantly, the priests who wrote this inscription were relying upon the land grants made by this Pharaoh to justify their claim to some land. They were not writing what they believed was an ancient myth. They obviously believed the land grants made by Pharaoh Djoser to still be valid and of enough authority to still be in effect well over 1,000 years later. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. Only the land of the priests bought he not, for the priests had a portion assigned them of Pharaoh. Ancient Egyptian records list Djoser as the 16th Pharaoh of Egypt, and historians have classified him with the so-called Third Dynasty. His chancellor, named Imhotep, was first known through the writings of the Egyptian historian Manetho, who in the 3rd century B.C. wrote, "During Djoser's reign there lived a man named Imhotep, who had the reputation of the Greek god of medicine, and who invented the art of building with hewn stone." The legends attributed to Imhotep were so incredible that he was considered to be mythical until this century, when excavations at Djoser's pyramid complex revealed the base of a statue with the name Djoser on it and the name Imhotep, with his long list of titles, one of which was chief under the king, a title which first appears with Imhotep and also was first bestowed upon Joseph. Imhotep was also the architect of Pharaoh Djoser's pyramid and surrounding complex, a veritable city within a city, of incredible beauty and extremely advanced in design. Built on the plateau of Saqqara, adjacent to ancient Memphis, the pyramid within the complex is the first ever built in Egypt. Imhotep was also the architect of Pharaoh Djoser's pyramid and surrounding complex, a veritable city within a city, of incredible beauty and extremely advanced in design. Built on the plateau of Saqqara, adjacent to ancient Memphis, the pyramid within the complex is the first ever built in Egypt. Ron Wyatt spent a great deal of time here searching for evidence which might shed light on the biblical account. Such an event as the famine described in the story of Joseph, and the distribution of grain to the other countries would have required a major facility and system of organization. When the famine came and Joseph's brothers came from Canaan to get grain from Egypt, we are told that they went to Joseph, which indicates that he personally oversaw the distribution, at least to those coming from foreign countries, and this would mean that there was certainly a central location or granary to which the foreigners came. The complex at Saqqara contains 11 massive pits, which even the Egyptians are at a loss to explain. They are not tombs, for all tombs were underground and carefully sealed, while these were accessible from the surface, and they are extremely large. But most fascinating is the fact that they are all connected by chutes. Ron believes these were the grain storage pits of the 7-year famine. As grain was removed from one pit, grain from the other pits flowed through the chutes, making the grain always accessible from one location. These are within the wall of the step pyramid complex, which has only one entrance, and it opens to a long covered passageway with small cubicles on each side, each just the right size for a person to sit with perhaps a small table. The narrow, singular entrance would have allowed only a few people to enter at a time. There was no doubt in Ron's mind that this was the main center of grain distribution on a massive scale. When they arrived to get their grain, the people lined up to enter the long corridor. Once inside one of the cubicles for the amount of grain to purchase. Then they proceeded through the corridor, straight to the area of the grain bins. Once there, they descended the stairway next to the storage bins, handed their sack to a worker who filled it and returned it to them. Then they exited through a small door on the lower level, which led to the outside of the complex. When the pits were first excavated, bits of grain still remained in them, but the official explanation was that it was the remains of food placed in graves for the deceased. However, as we mentioned, these bear no resemblance to any ancient Egyptian tombs, but they do bear a marked resemblance to pits identified as grain storage bins in other ancient civilizations. During the 7-year famine, Egypt gained great wealth and prominence among the nations through the selling of the grain. The Egyptians who lived in their cities along the Nile had little to do during the famine, since they had a 7-year supply of grain to rely on, and were able to devote their time to the building projects of the Pharaoh, not as slaves, but as grateful subjects. The family of Jacob, who lived in the Delta, separate from the native population, prospered and grew, exempt from the 1/5 taxation levied on the native population. From the time Jacob's family came to Egypt until the birth of Moses was about 180 years. Many pharaohs had come and gone, many ruling contemporaneously with others in different regions, but until now all recognized the rights granted to the people of Israel to live in the land of Ramses. But that was about to change. Exodus 1:8. There arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Israel had remained a separate race from the Egyptians, and had grown and prospered to such an extent that they were viewed as a potential enemy nation right in the midst of Egypt. But the Pharaoh didn't want to banish the Israelites, because they were skilled craftsmen, adding great wealth to the nation. By oppressing them with the bondage of hard labor, he sought to subdue them and crush their spirit. When this failed, the king then sought to decrease their number by issuing a decree that every Hebrew male born alive was to be cast into the river and drowned. It was at this time that Moses was born, and hid by his mother in an ark of bulrushes, placed in the river, and rescued by the Pharaoh's own daughter. Raised as the Pharaoh's grandson, he was considered part of the royal family, but his loyalties remained with his own people. When Moses killed an Egyptian for smiting a fellow Hebrew, he incurred the wrath of his adopted grandfather, the Pharaoh, and he fled Egypt to Midian. There he married the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, a worshipper of the true Creator. 40 years later, he was called of God at the burning bush to lead his now enslaved people out of Egypt. The rest of the story is well known, but the apparent lack of any evidence has led scholars to either doubt the truth of the entire story, to try to downplay the events and explain them in terms of natural science, or explain them as normal events which were blown out of proportion. Ron Wyatt believed they occurred exactly as the Bible stated.
Ron was right.
After the final plague, which took the lives of the firstborn throughout all of Egypt, Pharaoh called Moses and said, "Rise up, and get you forth from among the people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said, and take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." With sandaled feet and staff in hand, the people of Israel had stood hushed, awed, yet expectant, awaiting the royal mandate that they should bid them go forth. Before the morning broke, they were on their way. The Israelites had been scattered throughout the empire of Egypt by this, wherever they were told to work for the Pharaoh. But during the plagues, they had all slowly returned to Goshen or Ramses. Exodus 12:37. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. They journeyed from the land of Ramses or Goshen, and encamped or gathered at Succoth. When the people were given the feast of unleavened bread, God told them, "For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever." This scripture clearly told Ron that they left Egypt that very day, and that Succoth was outside of Egypt proper. Many Egyptologists and scholars agree that the ancient Egyptian frontier fortress, called Tharu or Thaku, was ancient Succoth of the Exodus account, as it corresponds linguistically with the Hebrew word. Thaku was the last Egyptian city on the northeastern border, and was where the ancient pharaohs organized their armies as they prepared to go to war to the north and east. It was the only place large enough for several million people with their flocks and herds to be gathered together. And the journey of such a massive group would have been impossible without order, and Ron believed that it was at Succoth or Thaku that they were organized for travel. Here their journey began, but where were they going? Moses had asked to take the people 3 days' journey out of the land of Egypt to worship the true God. But by the command of God, Moses knew they would not return. He had been in Midian when he had seen the burning bush and had been called by the Lord to deliver his people out of bondage. And though he had been told he would lead them to the promised land, they were first to come to Mount Sinai, for God had told him, Exodus 3:12, "This shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain." Many scholars agreed that Midian was in the northwest sector of present-day Saudi Arabia, but they somehow missed the fact that Mount Sinai was also in Midian. So, from Succoth, they set out for Midian and Mount Sinai. But the direct route, which would take them directly east, since they had to go around the eastern finger of the Red Sea, was too dangerous. Exodus 13:17, "And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, Lest peradventure the people repent when they see war, and they return to Egypt." The Philistines lived along the coasts. Ancient records show peaceful relations between the Philistines and Egypt at this time, but had they encountered the Israelites, they would have regarded them as escaping slaves and captured them to return them to Egypt. Therefore, God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. Throughout known history, the desolate peninsula located between the two fingers of the Red Sea has remained uninhabited except for small, isolated groups of Bedouin. The ancient Egyptians operated mines there, but the conditions for life were so terrible that one official left a stele behind telling of his experiences there. Quote, "The highlands are hot in the summer, and the mountains brand the skin." And this desolate and forbidding region, nestled between the two fingers of the northern end of the Red Sea, was quite reasonably called in the biblical account the wilderness of the Red Sea. Instead of taking the people across the flat northern plain, Moses led them through the more mountainous region where they were protected by the mountains. At the end of 3 days, when the Israelites continued their journey, instead of returning in the direction of Egypt, spies and lookouts flashed signals across the mountains. Exodus 14:5, "And it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled." When they arrived at Etham, in the edge of the wilderness, they had almost reached the northern tip of the arm of the Red Sea called the Cup of Aqaba, but it was here that God had another plan for his people. "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they turn and encamp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal-zephon. Before it shall ye encamp by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in." Had they continued their present course, they would have soon reached safety. But instead they turned south and entered into a massive group of mountains that were without escape. The winding 18-mile-long canyon, today called Wadi Watir, twisted towards the seashore at times less than 100 feet wide. It constantly looked like a dead end up ahead, but as they continued their journey, the mountains would seem to open up as they approached. Pharaoh knew the area and felt confident when he stated, "They are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in." Once they entered the Wadi Watir, there was no way out until they reached the sea. God had foretold how long their flight from the Egyptians would be when he gave them the feast of the unleavened bread, or bread of haste, which lasted 7 days. From Sukkoth to the beach at the Red Sea is about 140 miles. Could they have traveled this far in such a short time? Exodus 13:21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud, to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, to go by day and night. Traveling both day and night, they would have had only to average about 1 mile per hour, or 24 miles a day, to reach the sea in 6 days. Once they arrived at the sea, they encamped, but in great fear, for here they certainly felt trapped. Stories of the ordeal must have been passed down through many generations, for 1,500 years later the Jewish historian Josephus wrote, quote, "For there was a ridge of mountains that terminated at the sea, which were impassable by reason of their roughness and their flight." The enormous beach at present-day Nueva is certainly large enough to have held several million people in their flocks, and to the south the mountains extend to the sea, making further travel impossible. When Ron first explored this beach in 1978, he saw the mountains of which Josephus wrote that blocked further travel to the south. To the north he found the very ancient remains of an old Egyptian fortress, most likely built as an outpost for troops assigned to protect the Egyptian mine workers in the region from attacks from the north. The old structure remained in use for many, many years, as it had been repaired many times. Ron believes this was Pi-Hahiroth. Many people believe that the parting of the Red Sea could only have occurred at a place where it is relatively shallow. Perhaps that is why most people believe it took place at the Gulf of Suez, which is quite shallow compared to the Gulf of Aqaba, which in some places is 5,000 feet deep. It is also about 8 miles across from the beach at Nueva. The few bathymetric maps Ron was able to find showed that the depths from the Nueva beach to the opposite shore reached a maximum of about 900 feet, gently sloping, while on each side there were sheer drops to about 5,000 feet. There certainly appeared to be an underwater path which could have been traveled with the water removed. When Ron and the boys first came to Nueva, they went to the south end of the beach. There Ron found a Phoenician-style column lying in the sand near the water's edge. Examining it, he saw that there were no inscriptions still legible. Water erosion had damaged it beyond any repair. At that time, the Sinai was being occupied by the Israelis, and they were in the process of using dynamite to level part of the mountains that reached the Gulf in order to drive their tanks along the coast.
Noah's Ark. This saga began in 1977, when Ron began investigating a mysterious boat-shaped object which had been aerially photographed by a Turkish Air Force reconnaissance pilot while on a routine photo survey mission. The pilot, Lieutenant A. Curtis, took these photographs from an altitude of 10,000 feet, approximately 12 miles from Mount Ararat. They were examined by a Turkish captain assigned to photo interpretation, who spotted the symmetrical boat shape in what appeared at the time to be a lava flow. As a result, a team of Turkish explorers and researchers examined the object and discovered that its dimensions were indeed near those of the Ark as stated in the Bible, most particularly those of the length. Dr. Arthur Brandenberger, a stereophotogrammetry expert. After studying the object and comparing the measurements to those in the aerial photos, he was quoted as saying, "I have no doubt at all that the object is a ship. In my entire career, I have never seen an object like this on a stereo photo." The Bible does state in Genesis 8:4 that the Ark came to rest in the mountains, that's plural, mountains of Ararat. Could it be that the Ark came to rest on a smaller sister mountain of Ararat proper? Have well-intending prior expeditions searched Ararat only because it is the highest point in the area, and as a result, overlooked and neglected other possible landing sites of the Ark?
The name Ararat, as it appears in the Bible, is the Hebrew equivalent of Urartu, ancient country of Southwest Asia, mentioned in Assyrian sources from the early 13th century BC. This area included parts of eastern Turkey, Armenia, and Iran. Moses was not speaking of a specific mountain when writing Genesis. He was speaking of a country, Urartu. So the Bible was saying the ark came to rest in the mountains of the country of Urartu. In eastern Turkey, across the valley from Mount Ararat, is the site we will be visiting. This area was first photographed in an aerial survey conducted in 1959 by Francis Gary Powers. Later, Turkish Lieutenant Duripanar spotted the boat-shaped object in these photographs, so in 1960, a group from the United States journeyed to the site, but they prematurely concluded it was just a natural formation. That same year, Life magazine featured photos of the site. Is there a historical record from ancient civilizations of Noah's Ark existing? Berosus the Chaldean wrote, "It is said there is still some part of the ship in Armenia, at the mountain of the Chaldeans, and some people carry off pieces of the bitumen, which they take away, and use chiefly as amulets for the averting of mischiefs." Today, we can look at a map of Turkey and see this site listed as Nuhun Gemisi, or Noah's Big Boat. High on the mountain is the resting place of Noah's ship. The name of this mountain is translated as Doomsday Mountain, named so for the deadly event of the flood. As we drive up the mountain, we can see Lesser Ararat and Greater Ararat across the valley. Both are post-flood volcanic mountains that were not even here during the flood, and they would be the last place one should search for the Ark. We've finally made it to the Ark. Looking at it from the stern, or rear, one can see the boat-shaped outline of the Ark. It has a rounded stern and a pointed bow or front. The symmetrical shape indicates that it is a man-made structure. Photos taken at different times of the year have brought out different features of the boat. There was so much convincing evidence uncovered at the site that the Turkish government declared this area to be Noah's Ark National Park, and yet today, the world is unaware of this amazing discovery.
Before their very eyes, the machine tells the story of what lies beneath the surface of the object. There are massive keelsons, deck timbers, open chambers, gunnels, and other various configurations which specialists believe identifies the object as the remains of an ancient man-made ship.
Basically, the radar scans show the same thing that the metal detector scans did, only with more detail. They show there's a pattern. They show there's a pattern of linear lines, there's a pattern of cross lines, and there's a pattern of even distribution to these lines in both directions. Now, that's precisely what you would expect out of the remains of a ship-type object, because you would have a keel, you would have parallel lines, which would be keelsons, and you would have the transverse lines, which would be bulkheads and other reinforcing of the ship.
Compared to an aircraft carrier 1,000 feet long, we can see the Ark is quite large. The Ark was a high-tech vessel that was designed to survive a catastrophic flood that would destroy the surface of the Earth. Complete with a keel, keelsons, and anchor stones, it was truly a work of art designed to save the human race from annihilation. The Bible tells us the Ark was 300 cubits in length. The Ark formation has been measured to be 515 feet long, which is exactly 300 Egyptian cubits. Moses, when writing the Genesis account, would have been accustomed to using the longer Egyptian cubit of 20.6 inches. The Bible mentions an earlier cubit, cubits according to the former measure. This references the Egyptian cubit, which was divided into 28 digits, making up the cubit rod. Many centuries later, the 18-inch Hebrew cubit was developed and implemented. One can easily see the rib timbers near the stern on the starboard side of the Ark. This was part of the superstructure of the Ark. We are now standing on the middle deck of the Ark, and now pan over to the interior of the port side, where we can see 4 horizontal protrusions in a row. They are arranged in a regular pattern, indicating man-made construction. These would have been horizontal deck support timbers, extending toward the middle of the deck. At the stern, we can see the symmetrical shape of the boat, including the center mound, where the decks have collapsed, one on top of another. Continuing to inspect the stern, we can see 5 objects in a row along the inside port area of the deck. These have been measured at regular intervals and appear to be vertical posts that would have supported the deck. The Ark originally came to rest higher on the mountain, but was pulled down to its current location amidst a lava or mud flow. Ron Wyatt was operating his ground-penetrating equipment before Turkish authorities when he spotted an object just below the surface. What they found was this beautiful deck timber. It was tested at Galbraith Labs for organic carbon. The level of organic carbon was extremely high, thus proving this object was once living matter, consistent with wood. Mr. Wyatt was able to display the deck timber on CNN when he was interviewed on their network. The timber is in 3 layers, much like plywood, with glue oozing out at the end. This makes it stronger than one solid piece of wood. The outer area is covered in black pitch. Some nails can also be seen on its surface. This layering of wood may have been the gopher wood mentioned in Genesis. Just above the Ark site is the Uzungili village. Its former name, in the 19th century, was Nasr. This pronunciation is similar to Nicer, a village that the Babylonian Berosus described as being near the Ark site. Josephus in the 1st century said, "Its remains are shown there by the inhabitants to this day." This would tell us the Ark would be in an accessible location. These local villagers would have had a tourist trade, accommodating visitors to the Ark. The visitors to the Ark would have stayed overnight here, and would have bought souvenirs in the village. Using radar equipment, Ron Wyatt discovered an open cavity on the starboard side of the Ark. Utilizing a core drilling technique, he was able to gain access to the interior of the Ark. Stunning evidence was pulled from the belly of the ship. Using an improvised long rake device, petrified animal dung was extracted from the hull. Next, cat hair was also pulled from the cavity. Then, a petrified antler was extracted. These are all items that one would expect to find in the bottom of the Ark. The Bible tells us the antediluvians were skilled in metalworking. Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. This large metal rivet, or metal washer around a metal rod, was found by Ron Wyatt when he had taken a tour group to the site in 1991. The center rod had been struck while it was hot, causing it to flare out, holding the washer in place. Test results showed that it contained 8% aluminum metal. Aluminum metal is man-made, thus proving the site to be man-made. They used a metal detector to locate metal fittings on the Ark. This is a crescent-shaped piece of metal that had been a circular washer in its better days, and was found near the bow, on the port side. A portion of it tested at Galbraith Labs in Tennessee, and the results were stunning. It was 8% aluminum metal, just as Ron Wyatt had revealed. The test additionally showed a small amount of titanium metal that is also man-made. The Ark Discovery team continued its analysis at the site and located another fitting on the starboard side. A portion of it was sent to Galbraith Labs for testing, and again, there were incredible results. It contained 8% aluminum metal, 1.3% titanium metal, plus 3.8% magnesium metal, all indicative of the Ark formation being a man-made structure. The Encyclopedia Britannica tells us, because of its chemical activity, aluminum never occurs in the metallic form in nature. These unique metal components are special markers that were left behind, which prove the site is without a doubt a man-made structure, utilizing high-tech construction techniques, consistent with what we should find in Noah's Ark. Modern man didn't discover how to make aluminum metal until around 1900, but the antediluvians had this knowledge in their day. Just down the valley from Noah's Ark, we come to the village of Kazan, where portions of the Ark's directional system were released, thus allowing the Ark to float more freely.
Villagers tell Ron that the village in which the standing anchor stone rests is known as the Village of Eight. Also, this majestic valley, located a few miles from the village, is known as the Valley or Region of the Eight. None of the inhabitants of this region know how these names came to be. They've been passed down from generation to generation. Again, he clearly finds reference to the 8 survivors of the flood. Here is another strong indication that someone from antiquity has left record of the landing place and survival of Noah and his family. This mystical and enchanting region.
The alignment of these stones tell us the direction from which the boat came as it approached and the mountain that it landed on. One of these stones is approximately a quarter of a mile from the boat itself. Now, these stones, or this type anchor stone, is a very familiar object to the students of early navigation. They were used by many of the early civilizations, the Phoenicians in particular, and the shores of the Mediterranean and the floor of the Mediterranean is strewn with these stones. The difference that becomes obvious immediately is the difference in size.
Only in size or scale do these stones differ significantly from their considerably smaller Mediterranean counterparts. If the size of the stone anchors implies the size of the boat or ship on which they were used, how much more should it be true for these stone anchors weighing several tons to be, by this standard, Ark-size stone anchors?
The large anchor stones were hung from the rear of the Ark to keep the rear-facing oncoming waves. It created a type of resistance in the water, allowing the rounded rear of the Ark to fend off powerful waves that would critically damage the Ark if struck broadside. This is our first anchor stone. Measuring 11 feet in height, with 4 feet embedded in the ground, it is actually the largest and most beautiful anchor stone found to date. A tapered hole was drilled into the top of each anchor stone, a 5-inch opening on one side and a 7-inch opening on the other, allowing a rope to be pulled through and a knot tied. It was designed to be lifted while in the water when it would weigh less, thereby preventing the top from breaking off. The most striking feature is the crosses that have been carved on the anchor stone. Early Christians came through this area and recognized these objects as biblical items from the Ark. They carved crosses on these anchor stones, representing Noah and his family. The largest cross here represents Noah and is of the Crusader style. The diamond shape of the cross above was Nimrod's sign when he was alive. The diamond represents the Ark that he took credit for. Then the vertical line is the pathway to heaven, with the crossbar representing heaven. The Egyptians had an adaptation of this symbol called the Ankh. Smaller anchor stones, or drogue stones, can be found near the Mediterranean. This is one of the largest you will ever see outside the Noah's Ark area. The next anchor stone is partially buried in the ground, with 5 crosses. The largest cross represents Noah. The next smallest, Mrs. Noah. Then the 3 smallest are the sons of Noah. At the bottom is a possible image of the Tower of Babel, which was built around 200 years after the flood by Nimrod and his rebellious followers. This particular stone has 7 crosses, with the 8th having been removed at some point in time. This stone has a large cross representing Noah. The next smaller cross in the bottom left is Mrs. Noah. The next 3 smaller crosses represent the 3 sons. Then, the 3 smallest represent the wives of the sons. This stone does not have any carvings on it, but it does have a hole drilled through the top. Other stones have been found buried, but they have no inscriptions. This stone had a hole drilled in the left side. Then on the right, we can see ancient inscriptions. Vandals have broken this stone, but you can see where the hole once was in the top. Crosses have also been carved on this stone. Of Kazan is a large object that has the appearance of petrified tree bark and with unusual characteristics.
As far as we know, there's nothing else like this anywhere. Nobody's ever... My goodness. It's got crosses that are very faintly carved on it. You got a big one here. You got a small one right there. One here. One here. They're harder to see over here.
And this is petrified wood?
Well,
It looks like
Ron said he thought it was petrified
bark.
tree bark.
Right.
If you look at the... You ever seen... It looks like a little bit like pine bark.
It sounds like metal.
Yeah, but what about the anchor stone being wood?
This isn't an anchor stone.
Oh, I see.
This was just like something that was on the ark, right?
Well, Ron theorized that this might have been the or part of the cover. You remember at one point it says, and Noah came out of the ark and he took the cover off, or he threw the cover off. And of course that's just speculation. We don't have a way of knowing, but this is a rather unique thing. It has the appearance and the texture of some kind of a bark, but you know, it is stone.
That is a cross.
What?
That is a cross.
There you go.
That is incredible.
It has a very hollow sound.
Very hollow. It sounds like metal.
But it's just a...
Well, it's just that's its harmonic ring.
Right.
In some way. Even the petrified remains of Noah's Ark, it's become a stone. A wooden ship that has fossilized.
You don't really understand sometimes what a terrible burden it is to know some of the things that I know. To try to wake people up and impart this knowledge to them. And find out that they just have walls built in front of them. They want to be slaves.
I risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but it's no longer a theory. What I'm about to say is fact.
But not many stones that do that.
That's true. With the sun coming out.
That is incredible.
It has a very hollow sound.
Very hollow. It sounds like metal.
But it's just a...
Well, it's just that's its harmonic ring.
Right. Yeah, my resonance, you're right, yeah.
But not many stones that do that.
That's true. With the sun coming out.
Well, I think there's 8 crosses on it. We've been able to find 7. I think there's an 8th one up there.
Our next taxi stop is the home of Noah, near the village of Kazan. This photo was taken in 1977 by Ron Wyatt, showing the walls of Noah's home. Since then, all the walls have been torn down by local treasure seekers. In the front yard stood this large tombstone. On the tombstone was a drawing of 8 people and a boat on a wave. The second largest person was looking downward with their eyes closed. This indicates that this was Mrs. Noah's tombstone. After Mr. Wyatt showed this to someone, that person later hired others to exhume Mrs. Noah's 18-foot sarcophagus. Its depression in the ground is still visible today. Her jewelry was later sold on the black market for millions of dollars. Extending out from Noah's house are these ancient stone fences for containing animals. In Genesis, we are told that Noah practiced husbandry. In this case, we can see signs of animal husbandry. Some fences are more prominent than others, but they are all in straight lines.
Harmonic.
Right.
Yeah.
Harmonic resonance, you're right, yeah.
But there's not many stones that do that.
That's true.
With the sun coming out.
Well, I think there's 8 crosses on it. We've been able to find 7. I think there's an 8th one up there.
Our next taxi stop is the home of Noah, near the village of Kazan. This photo was taken in 1977 by Ron Wyatt, showing the walls of Noah's home. Since then, all the walls have been torn down by local treasure seekers. In the front yard stood this large tombstone. On the tombstone was a drawing of 8 people and a boat on a wave. The second largest person was looking downward with their eyes closed. This indicates that this was Mrs. Noah's tombstone. After Mr. Wyatt showed this to someone, that person later hired others to exhume Mrs. Noah's 18-foot sarcophagus. Its depression in the ground is still visible today. Her jewelry was later sold on the black market for millions of dollars. Extending out from Noah's house are these ancient stone fences for containing animals. In Genesis, we are told that Noah practiced husbandry. In this case, we can see signs of animal husbandry. Some fences are more prominent than others, but they are all in straight lines. Uphill, behind Noah's home, is this large altar that he would have used to sacrifice animals to the Lord. It is approximately 10 feet in diameter and has a cube-like shape. In conclusion, we can say that the Darupanar, Noah's Ark formation, is full of evidence which confirms its authenticity, especially when we objectively consider all the information. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, "Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters, who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city." Lot, his wife and daughters, all fled from the terrible destruction of Sodom. Likewise, as it was also in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Wicked men were punished by the Lord in a divine judgment of fire. The intense heat consumed the wicked cities and their inhabitants. But Lot's wife looked back toward her beloved Sodom, violating the angel's command, and was thus turned into a pillar of salt. Turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example of those who afterward would live ungodly. This is a visible example that is mentioned here. The Bible tells us the cities were in the plain of Jordan, which is the area surrounding the Dead Sea, and it was once a beautiful, lush area. At 1,300 feet below sea level, this is the lowest place on earth, a very hot and desolate region that was cursed by God because of the sins of the people. Sodom had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Flavius Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, tells us, "There are still the remainders of that divine fire, and the traces of the 5 cities are still to be seen." Popular thought has it that the cities were later covered by the waters of the Dead Sea, but if Josephus could see the cities in his day, then we should be able to view them also, as the water level has, if anything, receded since his time. And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as you go toward Gerar, as far as Gaza, then as you go toward Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. The biblical description tells us the cities were spread out, forming a line along the Canaanite border, not grouped together in one area, as some may think. Driving along the coastal highway of the Dead Sea in Israel, one can soon see peculiar formations that are of a lighter color than the surrounding terrain, We move in closer to inspect the unusual features evident on the side of the formation. On the side of the structure, this swirling pattern is different from any type of sedimentary rock or soil that would normally contain horizontal, even layers. These swirling designs were also seen in other ashen formations in the cities. This is evidence of extreme heat, up to 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, where thermal ionization occurs, when the electrons repel and attract, forming these unusual swirling designs. In Lot's day, this area was a swirling cauldron of death and destruction, rained down from the Lord in heaven. Strange anomalies can be seen here, such as these fragile layers of material which disintegrate when touched. The limestone buildings in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were totally transformed into ash by the consuming fire of the Lord. Ron Wyatt was the original discoverer of these cities in 1989, and he now describes the brimstone found here.
Okay, we're down at Sodom and Gomorrah still. Right in front of you see some unusual looking spots on this, shall we say, layer of ash. It's not stone, it's ash. Now we'll move in for a close-up of this. And you can see that they're kind of circular shaped places. Now what we have found, and we'll move in a little closer here, is that inside each of these is sulfur. That is in most of them. Now the ones that do not have sulfur in them, and this one we just took a bunch of sulfur out and put it in our specimen bag. But the ones that don't have sulfur have a very black center where they have, where it's been very hot. So now we'll move in on this one where there is some sulfur still present, and back off just enough so you can see what we're up to here, and we'll go collect that sample in a bag. Before I started using this knife, it was very, very sharp. Okay, here this is, and we have collected some more, and it smells and tastes like sulfur. Now the Bible tells us that it rained fire and brimstone upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now what you see in front of you here is the results of large and small, well, varying sized chunks of sulfur, burning sulfur that have hit. And what we find here is that God rained this burning sulfur down upon this city, and rain is a perfect description of it. It landed just in the pattern that rain would fall, and the stuff, of course, the accumulative heat of all of this upon the city set the entire thing ablaze. The flash point of every material there, metal, stone, of course the people, and everything burned, and this sulfur continued to burn, and it vitrified the material around it after it had burned it all up, sealed itself off from the oxygen, and then of course smothered itself out. And in each of these little crystalline capsules here is a varying size chunk of sulfur, and there are millions of these in these ashes that we have here. Now some of them we have cracked open so you can see the sulfur inside, and others we have left intact, but there are millions of these here. So this shows that God indeed rained fire and brimstone upon these cities. And if you look in your dictionary, under brimstone, you'll find that it is sulfur.
A piece of the brimstone from the cities was lit at night, and soon there was a beautiful blue flame produced by the burning sulfur. A very strong aroma of sulfur filled the air, and was overpowering if one directly breathes the fumes. Exploring the cities further, more brimstone was found of various shapes and sizes. Several samples had been washed down to areas below and were added to our growing collection. This brimstone is made of monoclinic, white sulfur that has been burned or cooked at a high temperature. It is quite different from natural sulfur that is formed in geothermal areas. Samples were taken to a lab for analysis. Each specimen was carefully separated and prepared for testing, with the outer portion cast aside. Next, the samples were dried and placed in a rock crusher. Then they were pressed onto a disc. Then they were loaded into a machine for the semi-quantitative X-ray analysis. Each sample was individually transported into the testing chamber for analysis. The results proved to be quite amazing. As the samples were found to be 98% pure sulfur, unlike any other sulfur found on Earth. This pure, cooked sulfur is the heavenly marker that was left behind to show the world that the Lord, without a doubt, destroyed these sinful cities at His command. Critics have said that the sulfur is from volcanic activity, but that type of rhombic sulfur is only 40% sulfur and is of a crystalline form, unlike the white, compacted monoclinic form that is found in the ashen cities today. Here is a round piece of brimstone embedded in a section of ash. Another clump of ash contains a piece of brimstone that has a burn ring surrounding the unburned sulfur inside. This mound of material has a lid that easily comes off, revealing the round nugget of brimstone inside. As we gaze across the southern end of the Dead Sea, we can view the El Lisan Peninsula in Jordan. Apparently the city of Gomorrah extended over to this peninsula in the days of Lot. One can find the same white formations in this area. Ashen formations are seen, including walls extending out at 90-degree angles. We can also see clumps of gypsum scattered on the ground, like this one here. Brimstone is also found in this area. Incredibly, a Byzantine-era church was constructed here, as noted on this sign, built here because the area was known for its biblical significance. Back over at Gomorrah proper, we can see white, ashen worship structures built atop an acropolis, or high place. Both a sphinx and ziggurat are seen here, side by side, much like what we see in Egypt at Giza, with the Sphinx and the pyramids built in close proximity to each other. While inspecting Gomorrah, other visitors arrived to view the unusual formations. The Sphinx is made of a white material, whiter than the ash surrounding it. Perhaps it was built of more expensive components and dedicated to their pagan gods. The Sphinx represented a god of protection, but even it was consumed in the flames. It is approximately 30 feet long and is quite impressive, both in its shape and size. Resting near it is the ziggurat, symmetrical in shape and also comprised of a special white material. Here we can see a ziggurat standing next to a symmetrical tower. Next, we can see an arched door between two pillars, and once again, another arched door. As we scan across the city, our eye notices a raised white formation in the distance. As we near the formation, we can see it is in the shape of a ziggurat. It turns out there are actually two ziggurats on this raised acropolis. As we stood next to one of the ziggurats, our team found perfect specimens of melted brimstone, where the liquid from the burning sulfur had cooled down, forming a hard, crystalline shell around the unburned sulfur that was hidden inside. On the outside of the ziggurat, we spotted a piece of brimstone fused into the side of the formation. Using a knife, it was opened, revealing the pure brimstone inside. Resting on a ledge of the ziggurat, we see another sample of brimstone that was opened with a knife, once again revealing the pure sulfur inside. The most impressive evidence was this cremated bone fragment that was left behind from some lost soul of Gomorrah. The bone marrow inside was cooked until it had turned white. This is a moving testimony of God's power to destroy those who reject the Holy Spirit. Are we in the will of God, allowing the Holy Spirit to guide us into obedience? Or are we part of the rebellious and lost?
When the pits were first excavated, bits of grain still remained in them, but the official explanation was that it was the remains of food placed in graves for the deceased. However, as we mentioned, these bear no resemblance to any ancient Egyptian tombs, but they do bear a marked resemblance to pits identified as grain storage bins in other ancient civilizations. During the 7-year famine, Egypt gained great wealth and prominence among the nations through the selling of the grain. The Egyptians who lived in their cities along the Nile had little to do during the famine, since they had a 7-year supply of grain to rely on, and were able to devote their time to the building projects of the Pharaoh, not as slaves, but as grateful subjects. The family of Jacob, who lived in the Delta, separate from the native population, prospered and grew, exempt from the 1/5 taxation levied on the native population. From the time Jacob's family came to Egypt until the birth of Moses was about 180 years. Many pharaohs had come and gone, many ruling contemporaneously with others in different regions, but until now all recognized the rights granted to the people of Israel to live in the land of Ramses. But that was about to change. Exodus 1:8. There arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Israel had remained a separate race from the Egyptians, and had grown and prospered to such an extent that they were viewed as a potential enemy nation right in the midst of Egypt. But the Pharaoh didn't want to banish the Israelites, because they were skilled craftsmen, adding great wealth to the nation. By oppressing them with the bondage of hard labor, he sought to subdue them and crush their spirit. When this failed, the king then sought to decrease their number by issuing a decree that every Hebrew male born alive was to be cast into the river and drowned. It was at this time that Moses was born, and hid by his mother in an ark of bulrushes, placed in the river, and rescued by the Pharaoh's own daughter. Raised as the Pharaoh's grandson, he was considered part of the royal family, but his loyalties remained with his own people. When Moses killed an Egyptian for smiting a fellow Hebrew, he incurred the wrath of his adopted grandfather, the Pharaoh, and he fled Egypt to Midian. There he married the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, a worshipper of the true Creator. 40 years later, he was called of God at the burning bush to lead his now enslaved people out of Egypt. The rest of the story is well known, but the apparent lack of any evidence has led scholars to either doubt the truth of the entire story, to try to downplay the events and explain them in terms of natural science, or explain them as normal events which were blown out of proportion. Ron Wyatt believed they occurred exactly as the Bible stated.
Ron was right.
After the final plague, which took the lives of the firstborn throughout all of Egypt, Pharaoh called Moses and said, "Rise up and get you forth from among the people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said, and take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." With sandaled feet and staff in hand, the people of Israel had stood hushed, awed, yet expectant, awaiting the royal mandate that they should bid them go forth. Before the morning broke, they were on their way. The Israelites had been scattered throughout the empire of Egypt by this wherever they were told to work for the Pharaoh. But during the plagues, they had all slowly returned to Goshen or Ramses. Exodus 12:37. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. They journeyed from the land of Ramses or Goshen, and encamped or gathered at Succoth. When the people were given the feast of unleavened bread, God told them, "For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever." This scripture clearly told Ron that they left Egypt that very day, and that Succoth was outside of Egypt proper. Many Egyptologists and scholars agree that the ancient Egyptian frontier fortress, called Tharu or Thaku, was ancient Succoth of the Exodus account, as it corresponds linguistically with the Hebrew word. Thaku was the last Egyptian city on the northeastern border, and was where the ancient pharaohs organized their armies as they prepared to go to war to the north and east. It was the only place large enough for several million people with their flocks and herds to be gathered together. And the journey of such a massive group would have been impossible without order, and Ron believed that it was at Succoth or Thaku that they were organized for travel. Here their journey began, but where were they going? Moses had asked to take the people 3 days' journey out of the land of Egypt to worship the true God, but by the command of God, Moses knew they would not return. He had been in Midian when he had seen the burning bush and had been called by the Lord to deliver his people out of bondage. And though he had been told he would lead them to the promised land, they were first to come to Mount Sinai, for God had told him, Exodus 3:12, "This shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain." Many scholars agreed that Midian was in the northwest sector of present-day Saudi Arabia, but they somehow missed the fact that Mount Sinai was also in Midian. So, from Succoth, they set out for Midian and Mount Sinai. But the direct route, which would take them directly east, since they had to go around the eastern finger of the Red Sea, was too dangerous. Exodus 13:17, "And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, Lest peradventure the people repent when they see war, and they return to Egypt." The Philistines lived along the coasts. Ancient records show peaceful relations between the Philistines and Egypt at this time, but had they encountered the Israelites, they would have regarded them as escaping slaves and captured them to return them to Egypt. Therefore, God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. Throughout known history, the desolate peninsula located between the two fingers of the Red Sea has remained uninhabited except for small, isolated groups of Bedouin. The ancient Egyptians operated mines there, but the conditions for life were so terrible that one official left a stele behind telling of his experiences there. Quote, "The highlands are hot in the summer, and the mountains brand the skin." In this desolate and forbidding region, nestled between the two fingers of the northern end of the Red Sea, was quite reasonably called in the biblical account the wilderness of the Red Sea. Instead of taking the people across the flat northern plain, Moses led them through the more mountainous region where they were protected by the mountains. At the end of 3 days, when the Israelites continued their journey, instead of returning in the direction of Egypt, spies and lookouts flashed signals across the mountains. Exodus 14:5. And it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled. When they arrived at Etham, in the edge of the wilderness, they had almost reached the northern tip of the arm of the Red Sea called the Gulf of Aqaba. But it was here that God had another plan for his people. "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they turn and encamp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal-zephon. Before it shall ye encamp by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in." Had they continued their present course, they would have soon reached safety. But instead they turned south and entered into a massive group of mountains that were without escape. The winding 18-mile-long canyon, today called Wadi Watir, twisted towards the seashore, at times less than 100 feet wide. It constantly looked like a dead end up ahead, but as they continued their journey, the mountains would seem to open up as they approached. Pharaoh knew the area and felt confident when he stated, "They are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in." Once they entered the Wadi Watir, there was no way out until they reached the sea. God had foretold how long their flight from the Egyptians would be when he gave them the feast of the unleavened bread, or bread of haste, which lasted 7 days. From Sukkoth to the beach at the Red Sea is about 140 miles. Could they have traveled this far in such a short time? Exodus 13:21. "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud, to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire, to give them light, to go by day and night." Traveling both day and night, they would have had only to average about 1 mile per hour, or 24 miles a day, to reach the sea in 6 days. Once they arrived at the sea, they encamped, but in great fear, for here they certainly felt trapped. Stories of the ordeal must have been passed down through many generations, for 1,500 years later the Jewish historian Josephus wrote, quote, "For there was a ridge of mountains that terminated at the sea, which were impassable by reason of their roughness and their flight." The enormous beach at present-day Nueva is certainly large enough to have held several million people in their flocks, and to the south the mountains extend to the sea, making further travel impossible. When Ron first explored this beach in 1978, he saw the mountains of which Josephus wrote that blocked further travel to the south. To the north he found the very ancient remains of an old Egyptian fortress, most likely built as an outpost for troops assigned to protect the Egyptian mine workers in the region from attacks from the north. The old structure remained in use for many, many years, as it had been repaired many times. Ron believes this was Pi-hahiroth. Many people believe that the parting of the Red Sea could only have occurred at a place where it is relatively shallow. Perhaps that is why most people believe it took place at the Gulf of Suez, which is quite shallow compared to the Gulf of Aqaba, which in some places is 5,000 feet deep. It is also about 8 miles across from the beach at Nueva. The few bathymetric maps Ron was able to find show that the depths from the Nueva beach to the opposite shore reached a maximum of about 900 feet, gently sloping, while on each side there were sheer drops to about 5,000 feet. There certainly appeared to be an underwater path which could have been traveled with the water removed. When Ron and the boys first came to Nueva, they went to the south end of the beach. There Ron found a Phoenician-style column lying in the sand near the water's edge. Examining it, he saw that there were no inscriptions still legible. Water erosion had damaged it beyond any repair. At that time, the Sinai was being occupied by the Israelis, and they were in the process of using dynamite to level part of the mountains that reached the Gulf in order to drive their tanks along the coast. Over and over Ron explained why he was there, and late one afternoon they took him in a helicopter and told him to show them where he believed the great multitude crossed the sea, with inscriptions in archaic Hebrew. The Saudis made numerous photos, chattering excitedly, and Ron explained that he believed it was erected in ancient times to mark the crossing site, and told
Daniel and Ronald Jr. returned to Nashville at the end of an amateur archaeology expedition that landed them in a Saudi Arabian jail. They entered Saudi Arabia illegally, searching for the site.
Again up into the mountain, this time bringing Aaron, his sons, and the 70 elders of Israel. Directly above the altar is a plateau in the mountain, just below the scorched black of the high peak. We believe this is where the group of men did eat and drink, and saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and as it were, the body of heaven in its clearness. they were given the same glimpse of the heavenly throne that Ezekiel saw in vision. Then I looked, and behold, in the firmament that was above the head of the cherubim, there appeared over them, as it were, a sapphire stone, as the appearance of the likeness of a throne. Moses was again called up into the mountain, this time with Joshua. For 6 days the men waited, and then on the 7th day God called Moses up into the cloud that covered the very top of the mount, into the presence of the Lord. For 40 days he remained there, while Joshua waited for him in the lower plateau. In the midst of the blackened peak is a hollow area within the burned top which appears unscorched. From this hollow there is a visible pathway leading down to the plateau. We believe this was where Moses met with God and received the ceremonial law, the statutes and judgments, and the 10 Commandments. Moses carefully recorded all he was told. Then something terrible occurred. The Lord said unto Moses, Go, get thee down, for thy people which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed unto it, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation. Moses pleaded with God for his people, that he not destroy them, and finally God accepted his plea on their behalf. But Moses' anger with the people was also great. With the 2 tables of stone cradled in his arms, Moses began down the mountain and approached Joshua, waiting in the plateau. As he came near, Joshua said, There is a noise of war in the camp. But Moses replied, It is not the voice of them that shout for mastery, neither is it the voice of them that cry for being overcome, but the noise of them that sing do I hear. Then they came to Elim, located at the south end of these mountains. After drawing their water, the Israelites set up camp. Because of the great number of people and animals, they filled the wadi from Elim westward to the nearby Red Sea shore. The wilderness of Sin between Elim and Sinai is a large barren plain nestled between the mountains along the sea and the mountain range which contains Mount Sinai. Southeast of Elim is Al-Bad, the largest oasis in the region and the home of Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. Down through the ages until this very day, local traditions abound about Jethro and Moses in Al-Bad. It was in this wilderness of sin that the multitude again murmured against Moses and Aaron for bringing them into this barren desert to die of hunger. And it was here that the Lord first gave them manna, which appeared every day except for the Sabbath. In the south portion of the plain they retained some protection against the attack of the fierce Amalek, because the mountains along the sea and the longest arm of the Jabal Allah's range extend toward one another, forming a limited barrier to the north. But when they journeyed through the mountain pass, they were fully exposed. And here the cloud turned and led them east into the foothills on the western side of the great mountain range. Here they had limited protection within the hilly region. Exodus 17:1. And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys, according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. And once again the people became greatly upset with Moses. And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the people, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river. Take in thy hand, and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Visible for many miles around, this large rock, about 6 stories in height, stands atop this hill over 100 feet above the plain. With the elders looking on, Moses climbed atop the rocky hill to the standing boulder and struck it with his staff. From within the wall of the crack, large streams of water flowed out into the plain. The channels this water cut into the rock is still visible between the large crack, and the direction of the water flow can be seen in the channels cut into the earth. The rock of the hill upon which the boulder still sits displays signs of water erosion. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. Since the multitude was hidden only in the foothills as they traveled to Rephidim, the Amalek may have seen the cloudy pillar by day and fire by night, which may not have been visible while they traveled through the mountainous region. In Deuteronomy 25:18, Moses recounts the attack and how the Amalek, quote, met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary. Though a surprise attack from the rear, their position seemed to have afforded them some strategic advantage, for they were able to organize an army and go to battle the next day, armed with the weapons of the drowned Egyptians. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose us out men, and go out, fight with the Amalek tomorrow. I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon, and Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side, and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. After the battle, Moses built an altar to the Lord just a few 100 yards from the rock which brought forth the streams of water, and he called the name of it Jehovah Nisi. Rephidim means plains, and the flat land amid the foothills of the mountain range consists of thousands of acres, more than enough room for the great multitude to have camped, and for a great battle to have taken place. They had entered this wilderness of sin exactly 1 month after they had left Egypt, and would reach the encampment at Mount Sinai exactly 2 months after leaving Egypt. This indicates that they spent possibly up to 3 weeks here, and the area is abundant with evidences of their stay. These plains are littered with the remnants of ancient structures, such as these round hut circles. Though no one knows their exact function, it appears that a large center stone held up a tent, while smaller stones were placed along the edge of the tent to secure it. This would provide protection for a sleeping family from any wild animals, as well as from their own flocks. After the Amalek attack, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses in the wilderness, where he encamped at the mountain of God. Rephidim is located on the western side of the great mountain range the Bedouins still call Jebel Musa. The split rock from which the water came forth was called the rock at Horeb. They were at the holy mountain, but they were on the western side. Their next encampment would be on the eastern side. Exodus 19:1. In the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai, for they were departed from Rephidim, and were come to the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness. And there Israel camped before the mount. From Rephidim they continued their journey around the mountain range, first going north, then circling around to the east and south. As they entered the foothills on the eastern side, the rocky cliffs rose hundreds of feet on either side. Sandstone mountains were soon replaced by towering granite cliffs which rose to greater heights around them. Finally, they entered a massive plain surrounded by granite walls, which can be seen in this light photo. The cloud which was leading them stopped, and they gazed upon the lofty peak of Mount Sinai. Here was to be their home for almost a year. This was not an arbitrary stop along the route to Canaan. The people had nearly lost all true knowledge of God while under the influence of heathen Egypt. Moses had asked, "When I shall come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them?" The voice from the midst of the fire replied, "I am that I am." So shall ye make it. The ordinance of the sacrificial system, or ceremonial law, was made up of symbols pointing to the future Messiah, to his sacrifice and his priesthood. The solemn service of the sanctuary typified the grand truths that were to be revealed through successive generations. The cloud of incense ascending with prayers of Israel represented his righteousness that alone could make the sinner's prayer acceptable to God. The bleeding victim on the altar of sacrifice testified of a Redeemer to come, and from the Holy of Holies the visible token of the divine presence shone forth. The sanctuary was patterned after things in the heavens, holy places which were figures of the true, as Paul explained. The room that contained his earthly throne, the mercy seat, was called the most holy place and represented the throne of God in heaven. "There I will meet with thee, and I will commune with thee from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim which are upon the ark of the testimony. Beneath the mercy seat, within the ark of the testimony, were the tables of stone written by God's own finger and spoken by his own lips in the hearing of all of Israel. Thus was signified that God's government rested upon these laws, the complete standard of righteousness, and that they would be enforced throughout eternity. When the tabernacle and its furnishings were completed, instructions were given on the manner of the encampment. In the center of the camp the tabernacle was set up. Around it on the north, south, and east were the tents of the Levites who had the care of the tabernacle and the services therein. On the west side were the tents of Moses, Aaron, and his sons. Afar off from these, the other tribes were assigned to the north, south, east, and west. Beyond can be seen the vastness of the camp of the Israelites. About 10 miles in length from north to south, it's approximately 6 miles wide. To the west and north it is shielded by the sheer cliffs of the mountain range. To the east and south it is surrounded by the smaller dark hills, giving it the appearance of a massive ancient volcanic rim. The mixed multitude which had left Egypt with them was not allowed in the camp itself, and we believe they made their camps in the smaller plain to the east, which was separated from the main camp by the lower dark-colored mountains, which also resemble the rim of an ancient volcano. And here was home to the great multitude for almost a year. Here in this desolate region was an entire nation unto itself, sustained completely by God. The manna which fell here long ago ceased, but one very precious evidence remained. The Bible tells us about the manna. The people went about and gathered it, and ground it in mills, or beat it in a mortar, and baked it in pans, and made cakes of it. The broken millstone that was found in the camp did not belong to any of the handful of Bedouin who still roam through the area today. Their diet consists largely of dates, figs, camel's milk, and camel's meat. There is no grain here, no wheat, no corn. There is nothing to grind. But over 3,000 years ago, a whole nation of people daily ground manna in mills, and one of those broken millstones was left behind. After all the wonderful miracles God wrought in the deliverance of his people, when they left Mount Sinai and came to the border of the Promised Land, because of their lack of faith, God did not lead them in. Instead, they were doomed to wander for 40 years in the wilderness. Only 2 men who had left Egypt entered the land of Canaan, Joshua and Caleb. Why has God revealed these evidences today, after almost 3,500 years? Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10:11, "These things happened to them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come." Today we are at the border of the Promised Land, not the Canaan of old, but the city which hath foundation, whose builder and maker is God. Will we enter? Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life, and may enter in through the gates into the city. The Saudis made numerous photos, chattering excitedly, and Ron explained that he believed it was erected in ancient times to mark the crossing site, and told them that he had found an identical one on the opposite shore, whose inscriptions had been eroded away since it had fallen in the surf. That column probably saved Ron and the boys' lives. It was the shred of evidence that gave his story credence. But it was 78 days before they were cleared of the bogus charges which Ron later learned were phoned into the Saudi embassy by an acquaintance who had once worked with him on several projects.
3 weary Americans came home Monday night. Ronald Wyatt and his sons Daniel and Ronald Jr. returned to Nashville at the end of an amateur archaeology expedition that landed them in a Saudi Arabian jail. They entered Saudi Arabia illegally, searching for the site of the biblical Mount Sinai. Ronald Wyatt and his sons are with us in the studios of our Nashville affiliate WTVF to tell us all about it. Gentlemen, good morning.
Morning.
Mr. Wyatt, you there in the middle, and
Yes.
your sons on either side. Why did you, I didn't know that Mount Sinai was in Saudi Arabian territory. Why did you think it was?
We found some chariot parts that looked like the chariots found in King Tut's tomb in the Gulf of Aqaba, west of this Jebel El Lawz. We found these at depths from 60 feet out to 200 feet and over a stretch of about 1.5 miles. And we believe that that was the crossing site. And so in the biblical narrative, they arrived at Mount Sinai after crossing the Red Sea. The language in the Bible indicates that they stayed in a mountain, enclosed in a mountain. So an aerial map showed that this Jebel El Lawz had a large valley enclosed in the rim of an ancient volcano. There's about 5,000 acres in there. We felt this was the place. And in Exodus 24:4 and in Leviticus 6:28, 11:33, and 15:12, it tells of some artifacts that were to be found. There was to be 12 pillars of stone and an altar and some pottery. And so this is why we looked at that particular mountain.
Now, I know that you applied for a visa for about 4 years. It's very difficult to get into Saudi Arabia, and they turned you down, but then you decided to make a quick, and let's ask Daniel this, we'll give him a chance to talk, a quick jump across the border in Jordan and go in illegally. Did you think you could get in and out without being caught?
I don't know. It seemed kind of risky to me, yeah. I didn't think it sounded too easy.
Ronald Jr., why do you think they let you go, finally?
I'm not real sure. I guess they just found out that we weren't spies as they thought we were.
They thought you were Israeli spies, right?
Yeah, that's what we hear.
Any torture, kind of interrogation?
No. They just separated us and made sure our stories matched.
Yes. During the interrogation period, we were interrogated by 3 separate groups, the Coast Guard and then the local General Investigating Group and then from the ministry. And the Coast Guard interrogation was a very frightening experience for people that were totally inexperienced with spies and intrigue and all of this.
Are you going to go back?
We're not going back without the proper papers.
The Wyatts, thank you very much for joining us from Nashville this morning. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice to be back.
Come on.
You're going to see some amazing things that God is doing. Segment, we'll talk about Noah's Ark. We'll talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. We'll talk about the Red Sea crossing site, the Ark of the Covenant, the real Mount Sinai. We'll look at the evidence. There have been several major archaeological sites that have been relocated over the last 32 years and have gained world notoriety. We're going to be talking about Noah's Ark, Sodom and Gomorrah, pyramids. How many realize that the pyramids on the Giza Plateau is a biblical site? You know, the word pyramid means fire measures or light measures. It's not even an Egyptian word. And, but yet it's most often tied, scholars have tied it, historians have tied it to Egyptian culture and tradition. It's really a biblical site. You got this crossing of the Red Sea that we're going to look at, the real Mount Sinai. the Ark of the Covenant, of course, which is probably one of the most controversial. Gethsemane in the Garden Tomb. These things have been searched for by thousands of people, literally for centuries. You're aware of that, right? You're aware that thousands of people, scholars, professors, explorers, world leaders, have been looking and searching for these sites for centuries. Why didn't they find him? It wasn't the time, was it? Because anybody would say, wait a minute, no one man is going to go over on his vacation time and find virtually everything that every scholar's been looking for centuries. They're going to say, that's humanly impossible. And they're right. But the word, the operative word, is humanly. You see there a collection of squares on the screen. I just want you to take a second. Tell me how many squares you see collected there. How many are up there? Just real quick. Let's see if you're right. 20. You see what's obvious, right?
Yeah. 21.
Let's count them off. We're still going, aren't we? 30 squares. When you saw what was obvious, you know your mind said, I've got the answer. I'm satisfied that I have the answer. And your mind went on to something else. Okay, it was ready to go on to the next thing. But when you started looking a little bit deeper, when you started looking below the surface, you began to say, hey, there are other things below the surface. There are other things that aren't so obvious. Now that happens a lot in Bible study in general. In fact, if you were here yesterday evening with Brother Lee Forbes, he was illustrating this very concept on learning how to study the Bible. You know, we read over scriptures and we don't really understand what they mean until we start to dig. It's important to dig, right? God lays lots of gems below the surface. Well, you know what? He's done the same thing with the discoveries. A lot of people just look at what's on the surface and they say, oh, that couldn't be possible. You know, one guy finding all that, that's just absurd. You know, especially when Professor this so-and-so has been looking for this. And there have been eyewitness sightings of the Ark up on Mount Ararat. And you've heard it all before. Let's consider all 30 squares, all right? Let's consider 30 squares. What is really going on here? What is really happening here? Something beyond human intellect. Something beyond human initiative. Something special is going on here. One of the things that we noticed early on was that all of the sites involved stone in some way. Now maybe that was one of those 16 squares that you may have noticed, that everything involves stone in some way. Even the petrified remains of Noah's Ark, it's become a stone, a wooden ship that has fossilized.
Really understand sometimes what a terrible burden it is to know some of the things that I know. To try to wake people up and impart this knowledge to them. And find out that they just have walls built in front of them. They want to be slaves.
Now I risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but it's no longer a theory. What I'm about to say is fact.
Now, that's an important observation, and here's why.
The world power elite are
It
no
immediately,
longer
my mind went to Luke 19.
They have planned and are now leading
And here
us
is the
into a
story of
one-world
Christ
communist government.
riding into Jerusalem. You're all familiar with it. It's called his triumphal entry. They did this every year. The priests would go outside to one of the sheepfolds and find the Paschal lamb. And they would bring him back into the gates of the city through one of the gates, and the people had lined the street. And when, of course, the priest came in with the lamb,
Take a journey,
they would begin to shout,
the
wave their
rabbit
palm
hole.
branches,
Wake
throw
up,
down
my
their
friends,
cloaks,
there's some things that you have
so
to
that
know.
the
Everything
priest
you
could
ever
pass
thought
over.
you knew, it has to go.
It was a
For
commemoration
instance,
of the
NASA is the world's largest magic
Now,
show.
you're familiar with the story.
9/11 was
Jesus
a planned
comes
demolition
riding
and Sandy
through
Hook was a scam. Come on,
as the
man,
ceremony
are you
begins.
tripping?
And
Constant
what
programming being
happens?
crammed in your vision.
The
Just take
people
a
began
step
crying
back
out,
and
right? They
examine
began
this
waving the
prison.
palm branches,
Turn on
remembering
the
his
news
wonderful
and they're
work,
trying to
shouting and
blind
praising
you. All they
God,
ever
throwing
do is
down
tell
their
you
cloaks
lies and
for him
divide
to pass
you.
over.
There's nowhere you
And
can
what do the
even hide.
Pharisees do?
They'll find you.
They
Illuminati,
come
all
hustling
seeing
over real
eye
quick
right
because
behind you. It's about time
Jesus
you
is
find out we're
preempting the
being
whole
lied to.
ceremony.
They're attempting to control the mind.
Jesus,
that's
tell
inside
your
you.
disciples,
Hide
tell the
you
people
from
to
the
be
power that
quiet.
designed you. Does anybody have a problem
And what does
with
Jesus
this?
say?
Well,
It's
I
right here
do.
for us.
I want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the
Master
truth.
rebuked
They
the
say they got
disciples.
it,
What
but
did
they're
he
never
say to them? I
coming
tell
up
you
with
that they
proof.
should hold their
If you're
peace.
looking, then they got you jumping through these
The
hoops. The
stones
lies always
would immediately
continuing to
cry out.
rise and busting through the roof. I want the
What
truth, the whole
didn't
truth, and nothing but the
the
truth.
Pharisees
They say they got it,
recognize?
but they're never coming up with proof. If you're looking, then they got you
Here
jumping
they're
through these
waiting
hoops. The lies
for the
always
priest
continuing
to bring
rise
the
and busting
lamb.
through the roof. They're
And
lying to
standing
us
right in
about
front of them
everything. How
is
can
the
this be?
priest
I know I'm not
and
crazy, and yet
the
I'm
lamb.
questioning my sanity. I see what the Illuminati's doing to humanity.
They fail
The
to
truth is
recognize
stranger
who
than
he
fiction.
was.
We're living in a fantasy.
If the people had
What
not
I'm
responded
witnessing
such,
is
the very
unreal.
stones would have
It's a
cried out.
one-way battle for us cattle going uphill.
So what's
If we
happening
don't
today?
stand and fight now, then no one will. Our children will never know freedom.
If the
It's a
people had
done
not
deal.
cried out,
The future's not looking
the
so
people had not
promising.
recognized
It's the poor who go to war while
and
the rich
remembered
keep
the
on
mighty,
profiting.
wonderful
It's
works
us
he had
that they're
done. You
slaughtering
see,
and money that
what
they're
were they
honoring.
remembering?
And soon
They
it's
were
gonna be
remembering
the new
all
world
of the
order that they're
miracles Jesus
offering.
had performed.
It's mind-boggling how so many don't seem aware.
And so they
And
knew
if they are, it's
there was
like they
something
really just
special
don't
about
even
this
care.
rabbi.
Our world is broken, and I'm hoping
You
it
read
can
through
be
the
repaired.
Gospel of John,
But
the
we'll
first
have to
couple of
fight for it,
chapters.
so just be
And it
prepared.
says
I
that
want the
Jesus
truth, the whole
performed
truth, and nothing
miracles,
but the truth. They
and that
say
the
they got
people
it, but they're never coming
recognized
up
who
with
he
proof.
was,
If
and they
you're
were
looking,
drawn
then they
to
got
him.
you jumping through these hoops.
Even
The lies
a
always
lot of the
continuing to rise
Pharisees,
and busting through the roof.
even
I
though they
want
weren't
the
in the
truth, the whole
majority.
truth, and nothing but the truth. They say
So it
they
was
got
that
it, but
physical
they're never
evidence
coming up
of
with proof.
manifestation
If
of
you're
God's
looking, then
power
they got you
that
jumping
drew
through these
them
hoops.
to
The lies
him.
always continuing to rise
If
and
the
busting
people had
through
been
the
quiet,
roof.
Forget the
the
politicians.
stones would have cried out. Now,
Politicians are put there
could
to
this
give you the
be what's
idea that you
happening
have
today?
freedom of choice. You don't.
Could God
You have no
see
choice.
that it's
You have
necessary
owners, and they own all the big
for
media
stones
companies, so
to
they
be crying
control
out today?
just about all of the news and information you
Why
get
would
to
that be
hear.
necessary?
They got you by the balls. They don't
Maybe
want
for
a
the same
population
reason?
of citizens
Maybe for the
capable of
same
critical
reason? Maybe the
thinking.
people don't really recognize the urgency of the hour? Jesus described the condition of his church at the end. He said, wait a minute, the people at the end, the church at the end, is going to be lukewarm. Lukewarm. They're going to be indifferent to their calling. They're going to be distracted from their mission. Do we see this prevalent in the church today? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, you know, Paul says to us, examine yourselves whether you even be in the faith. It's time for self-examination, just like on the Day of Atonement, isn't it? Indifferent to their calling, distracted from their mission. Jesus goes on in the parable, Matthew 25, to tell us that all of the virgins slumbered and slept. Now let me ask you, how much praising do you do when you're sleeping? Who does praising when they're sleeping? Maybe some of you do. Okay. Some hands out there. But not much praising is done when you're sleeping, when you're slumbering, when you're drunk with the cares of this life, of this world. God, knowing that this would happen, planned for the initiative. Took the initiative, and he planned for this condition. Look, we just spent over an hour and a half in a church service where Johnny did a marvelous job in basically illustrating the enemy's plan and ramblings. the lies and the theories and all the things that take us and distract us away from God. And all the nonsense that's going on today. If you can't see that the enemy knows that he must gain control of your life, then you're blind. If you can't see it, you're blind. Now, that is one of the conditions of Laodicea. They are blind. But I'm telling you, if you need to open your eyes if you can't see it. The enemy is trying to take complete control of your life. He has no other option. He has no other choice. He must gain full control of the world. And he'll do that primarily through the financial aspect of things. This is a bone that was picked up near where Mrs. Noah's grave was dug up. And of course her bones ended up going everywhere. And we'll talk about that maybe a little later. But this is a phalange bone. Does anybody know what bone that is? It's a finger bone. Look at the size of that. A finger, one of the phalange bones. It's 2.5 times larger, 2.5 times larger than the finger bones. I think this is the middle phalange bone. The middle phalange. Now I'm bringing this out because this person, which I believe was Mrs. Noah, because it was picked up where her grave was exhumed, robbed, would have been about 15 feet in height. Now let's see. Well, that'd almost be to the ceiling. Now just try to imagine, if you will, how much a person like that would weigh. Ladies, don't ever fuss about a diet or problem. I think Mrs. Noah was probably somewhere 6,000 to 7,000 pounds. But here's the thing. 2.5 times larger. The mass of that is incredibly larger than what our finger bones are today. Can you imagine the power these people had? I mean, the raw power. Probably 500 times stronger, maybe 1,000 times stronger than we are today. And they were beating on one another. They were fighting with one another. I can't even imagine that. But yet, God said, I can't take it anymore. Isn't that what Genesis really says? It says he came down and he said, I am grieved in my heart. I am sorry that I've ever made man. It hurts so much. He's like any other parent. He's a heavenly father. And he hurts when his children hurt. Just like we do. When we see our kids going through struggles, and don't we hurt for them? Don't we want to step in and try to make it all better just like that? After 120 years of extra probationary time, God stepped in and said, I've got to bring this to an end. He stepped in mercy. Stepped in mercy.